Before we begin the horror show, tell me where you're from. Drop your city name in the comments, and if there's a creepy story tied to it, I'll make sure to feature it in a future video. Your city's frightful past could be the next to terrorize us all. Vacations are meant to be an escape, a time to unwind and forget your troubles. But sometimes the places we visit hide secrets darker than we could ever imagine. From cursed cliffs to luxurious hotels with sinister intentions, these are chilling tales of vacations gone horribly wrong. Stay with us, if you dare, because by the end of this video, you may never look at a getaway the same way again. Story number 1. The Ocean's Eternity was a masterpiece of engineering and aesthetics, a behemoth of steel and glass that promised both adventure and luxury. It was the kind of ship that had stories etched into its corridors, legends whispered about its grandeur, and a mystique that made it irresistible to thrill seekers and wanderers alike. For Maggie Hayes, it was exactly what she needed, a retreat from the chaos of her life. Maggie had spent months tethered to her desk in a job that drained her soul, and the weight of a recent, gut-wrenching breakup still clung to her like a shadow. Her therapist had suggested a change of scenery, and this solo cruise seemed like the perfect opportunity. No co-workers, no ex-boyfriends, just her and the open sea. The Ocean's Eternity had been refurbished after decades of neglect, now boasting sleek interiors, gourmet dining, and entertainment that catered to every whim. Yet its past remained a mystery, shrouded in rumors of tragedies and unexplained disappearances. Maggie had seen the online chatter, ghost stories about the ship's haunted halls and tales of passengers who boarded but never left. She had dismissed it as typical internet folklore, the kind of thing meant to scare thrill seekers. As she stood on the main deck, leaning against the rail and watching the horizon stretch infinitely ahead, a sense of calm washed over her. The salt-laden breeze ruffled her hair, and the rhythmic lapping of the waves against the hull was hypnotic. "This is exactly what I needed," she murmured to herself, smiling for the first time in weeks. The ship's horn blared, signaling their departure, and Maggie felt a thrill as the massive vessel began to glide away from the dock. It was a fresh start, a chance to leave her troubles on shore. But even in that moment of optimism, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first evening aboard the Ocean's Eternity was enchanting. The grand dining hall was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linens, and a live band played soothing jazz. Maggie, seated at a table near the window, sipped on a glass of red wine as she watched the moonlight dance across the waves. Her table mates were a mix of solo travelers and couples, all friendly enough, though none particularly memorable. As the night wore on, Maggie excused herself, opting to explore the ship before retiring to her cabin. The hallways were impeccably designed, with polished wood paneling and plush carpets that muffled her footsteps. Yet despite the ship being fully booked, the corridors felt strangely empty. Maggie wandered past rows of doors, each identical to the next, until she found herself in a quieter part of the ship. The ambiance changed subtly. The air grew cooler, and the polished walls gave way to sections that seemed older, less refined. She came across a set of double doors with ornate handles. A small plaque above them read, "The Majestic Ballroom." Curiosity piqued, Maggie pushed the doors open. The room was vast and eerily silent, illuminated only by a faint, flickering light from a single chandelier. Dust particles floated in the air, catching the dim glow. The grandeur of the space was undeniable, with its high ceilings, intricate moldings, and a stage at one end. But it was clear this part of the ship had not been touched by the recent renovations. She stepped inside, her shoes echoing on the worn wooden floor. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air, mingling with something metallic. As she wandered closer to the stage, she noticed rows of chairs arranged neatly as if awaiting an audience. Her eyes fell on an object sitting at the center of the stage. A child's shoe, scuffed and worn, placed unnaturally in the spotlight. Maggie felt a chill creep up her spine. She turned to leave but froze when she heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and distant. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. She backed away, her heart pounding, and hurried out of the ballroom, the doors creaking shut behind her. When she reached the main corridor, she told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild in an unfamiliar setting. But as she lay in bed that night, the laughter echoed in her mind, refusing to fade. The next morning, Maggie woke to find her door slightly ajar. She distinctly remembered locking it before going to sleep. A wave of unease washed over her, but she brushed it aside, attributing it to the motion of the ship, or perhaps a forgetful moment on her part. Determined not to let her nerves ruin her trip, she spent the day enjoying the amenities. She swam in the pool, attended a cooking class, and even treated herself to a massage at the spa. Yet the strange emptiness of the ship lingered at the back of her mind. Later that evening during dinner, she overheard a group at a nearby table discussing the ship's history. They say it was built over the wreckage of an old liner that sank in the 1920s. One man said, his voice low and conspiratorial. A lot of people died, added a woman leaning in. There's even a rumor that some of the bodies were never recovered. Supposedly, their spirits haunt the ship. Maggie's stomach churned, though she told herself it was just the rich food. After dinner, she decided to take another walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. The hallways seemed quieter than ever, the soft hum of the ship's engines the only sound. She turned a corner and found herself back in the older section of the ship. The double doors of the ballroom were ajar, though she distinctly remembered closing them the night before. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The room was exactly as she'd left it, except for one chilling detail. There were now 2 shoes on the stage, arranged side by side. A cold sweat broke out across her skin as she backed away, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. And then, just as she reached the door, she heard it again. Laughter, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from behind her. Maggie's heart raced, her pulse hammering in her ears as she swung around, her breath shallow and fast. The ballroom behind her was empty, save for the 2 shoes placed on the stage. The laughter was gone, replaced by the disorienting silence that pressed against her chest like a heavy weight. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand trembling on the doorknob. A part of her wanted to bolt back to her cabin, to lock the door and forget about the eerie feeling settling in the pit of her stomach. But another part, one laced with both dread and curiosity, urged her to stay and uncover the mystery that clung to the ocean's eternity. With a hesitant step, Maggie turned and exited the ballroom, pushing through the grand hallway once again. The ship felt colder now, the air thick with an unnatural chill. She glanced over her shoulder but saw no movement. The ship was as silent as it ever had been. But something was different. Maggie continued to walk, her footsteps muffled against the thick carpeting, but the oppressive quietness of the ship began to make her feel as if she were the only one alive. The halls were empty. No crew members, no passengers, just the fading sound of the engines beneath her feet. It was as if the ship had been abandoned. She rounded another corner and found herself in front of a set of unfamiliar doors. They were tucked away in a quiet hallway she had not noticed before, their brass handles tarnished with age. There was no plaque, no sign, just an old wooden door that seemed completely out of place amidst the modern amenities of the ship. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to retreat back to the more familiar parts of the ship. But something drew her toward the door, an undeniable pull. The curiosity that had gotten her into this situation in the first place clawed at her, and before she could stop herself, she reached out and twisted the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that rushed up to meet her smelled musty, stale, as though it had been sealed off from the rest of the ship for years. Maggie's hand hovered at the doorframe, torn between the urge to explore and the fear that prickled her skin. But the idea of returning to her cabin and locking herself inside seemed even worse. She wasn't sure she could ever fall asleep again after what she had heard. Grabbing her phone from her pocket, Maggie turned on the flashlight and carefully descended the staircase. The steps groaned beneath her weight, echoing in the silence. She could feel the cold creeping up her legs, the temperature dropping the farther she went. The walls seemed to close in on her as she descended deeper into the ship's hidden belly. The staircase ended abruptly at another door, but this one was much older than any she had seen on the upper decks. It was made of dark wood, carved with intricate designs that seemed to swirl and writhe under the beam of her flashlight. Maggie hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. What greeted her on the other side was a sight she could never have prepared for. The room was vast, cavernous even. The walls stretched upward into shadow, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust so thick it almost seemed like the room hadn't been disturbed in years. But the most disturbing part of the space wasn't its age or abandonment. It was the rows of chairs. Rows and rows of empty chairs, each one neatly placed in perfect order. They filled the room, stretching far into the darkness until the light from her phone could no longer reach. As Maggie stepped further into the room, she felt her breath catch in her throat. The chairs were identical, black velvet armrests polished to a gleaming finish. But there was something profoundly wrong with them. Each one had a faint smudge, as though someone had brushed their hands across the fabric. Maggie moved deeper, the faint light from her phone flickering as if it were struggling against the overwhelming darkness. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something metallic she couldn't quite place. She scanned the room for any sign of movement. There was nothing, and then she heard it, a faint scraping noise, barely audible over the thudding of her own heart. It came from the far end of the room, the place where the light couldn't reach. The scraping grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of soft breathing, ragged and shallow. Maggie's hands shook as she held the flashlight in front of her, its beam dancing wildly over the rows of chairs. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust, and took a step forward. The scraping stopped, and then a voice. "Stay with us." Maggie's body froze. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It wasn't even a voice that sounded human. The words echoed through the room, vibrating in her skull. It was as though the very walls were speaking to her, urging her closer to whatever was waiting in the dark. Her feet moved before she could stop them. Slowly, cautiously, Maggie approached the source of the voice. Every instinct she had screamed for her to run, but the inexplicable pull of the ship's haunting past was too strong. As she neared the far end of the room, she saw something that made her stomach drop. At the far wall, illuminated by her phone's dim light, stood a massive mirror. The glass was cracked and the frame was ornate. But what was most unsettling was the reflection. It wasn't just her face looking back at her. Behind her there were figures, people, ghosts, dressed in clothing from a bygone era. Their eyes hollow, their faces slack with death. They stood motionless, watching her through the glass. And then, one by one, they began to move. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as one of the figures reached forward, pressing its hands to the glass. Its eyes locked onto hers and a raspy voice hissed from its lips. "Join us!" The glass shattered. Maggie stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The reflection had been too real, too tangible, and now the ghosts were free. She spun around and bolted toward the door, her feet slipping on the dust-covered floor. As she reached the door, she felt the coldness close in around her like a vice, and then the door slammed shut. Maggie's breath was caught in her throat as she stood frozen in front of the now closed door. Her pulse thundered in her ears, the oppressive silence of the room pressing down on her like a weight. The heavy thud of her heart was the only sound she could hear, drowning out everything else. She pressed her trembling hand against the door, willing it to open, but it didn't budge. The air had grown colder, her skin prickling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Maggie's eyes darted nervously from side to side as the room seemed to close in on her. Her fingers tightened around the handle, twisting again in desperation. Nothing. The coldness of the metal seeped into her palm like ice, a reminder of just how trapped she was. She turned away from the door, unwilling to face her fear anymore. The shadows around her seemed to grow longer, swirling and shifting in the corners of her vision. The figures in the mirror, those hollow-eyed, ghastly shapes, were still there, haunting her thoughts. She could almost hear them whispering, their voices echoing in her mind. "Join us!" The words sent a shiver down her spine. She felt as though the ship was closing in around her, its walls pressing tighter with every passing second. There had to be another way out. There had to be. Maggie's gaze swept across the room, and that's when she saw it. A narrow passageway at the far end of the room. hidden in the shadows. It was almost imperceptible, barely noticeable beneath the layers of dust and grime that had accumulated over the years. The light from her phone barely reached that corner, but something about the darkened entryway beckoned her. It was her only option. With no other choice, Maggie began moving toward it, her legs unsteady with fear. Every step was careful, calculated, as though the floor might give way beneath her at any moment. The scratching sound she had heard earlier, that eerie, unnatural noise, echoed faintly in the distance, as if it were following her. The passageway was narrow, barely wide enough for her to move through. Her flashlight flickered erratically as she stepped deeper into the dark. The air was thick with dust, and each breath she took felt like it was pulling the weight of the ship's history into her lungs. The walls of the corridor were lined with peeling wallpaper, its once elegant design long since faded into nothingness. The smell of mold and dampness made her gag. The deeper she walked, the more she could feel the ship itself, as if it were alive and aware of her presence. It creaked and groaned around her, its bones stretching under the weight of time. She could hear the faintest of whispers now, as though something or someone was calling her name. Maggie's heartbeat quickened. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing. The passage behind her remained dark, empty, but the feeling of being pursued lingered. Suddenly, she stopped. At the far end of the hallway, the light from her phone illuminated another door, this one much larger than the others. Its surface was old, weathered by time, and there was a faint glow coming from beneath it. She could hear something on the other side, a low hum, like the sound of something mechanical grinding in the distance. It was faint, but it sent a tremor of dread through her body. Her instincts screamed for her to turn back, to run, but something pushed her forward. She had to know what was on the other side. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door opened with a groan, its hinges protesting against the movement. Maggie stepped inside, her phone's light cutting through the darkness. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room beyond the door was not like the others on the ship. It was much larger, more expansive, and seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with shelves upon shelves, all stacked with old books. Some were bound in leather, others in fabrics that looked almost human. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else, a faint scent of rot that clung to everything in the room. And then there were the chairs, rows of them, lined up against the walls like some macabre audience waiting for a show. Each chair had a dark stain on it, some new, some old, as though the ship's past had been soaked into the very fabric of the place. In the center of the room stood a grand, ornate table, its surface covered with papers, old photographs, and objects that looked like they had been left there for years. But what made Maggie's stomach churn were the faces. Dozens of faces stared back at her from the pictures on the table, all of them twisted in expressions of terror. Their eyes, wide and vacant, seemed to follow her every movement. As she stepped forward, one of the photographs fell from the table, revealing a name scrawled in red across the back of it. Maggie Everett. Her heart stopped. It was her name. The blood-red ink was unmistakable. The sound of a door slamming shut made her jump. Maggie spun around, her flashlight flickering wildly. The door she had just entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall. She was trapped. Maggie's mind raced as she backed away from the wall, her breath quick and shallow. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for some kind of exit, some kind of escape. But the space around her felt claustrophobic now, its walls closing in as if the ship was alive, feeding off her fear. The photograph of her name, the one that had fallen from the table, lay at her feet. Maggie bent down, trembling, and picked it up. As she held it in her hands, she could feel the weight of something dark and ancient pressing down on her. It was as if the very fabric of the ship was woven into this moment, this nightmare. She couldn't breathe. "Stay with us," the voice whispered again, distant but unmistakable. Maggie turned sharply, her eyes scanning the shelves filled with old, rotting books. She had no idea who or what was speaking, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a demand. "Join us!" It came again, closer this time. Maggie staggered backward, her back hitting the cold stone wall. Her phone slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor, its screen cracking. The darkness deepened, and she could hear faint footsteps approaching. The floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen figures, the shadows stretching toward her as if trying to claim her. She had to get out. She had to leave, but the ship wouldn't let her. With every step she took, the shadows seemed to follow, moving with her, closing in from all sides. The voices, soft and haunting, whispered her name, growing louder and louder. Maggie stumbled forward, her mind racing as she tried to recall the layout of the ship. She had been here before, on the upper decks, where the sunlight had been warm and the air had smelled of the sea. But now it was suffocating. The walls seemed to stretch and bend with the weight of history. Suddenly, a piercing screech filled the air. The sound of a door slamming open. No, not a door. A mouth filled the space. Maggie's eyes widened in horror as she saw the source. At the far end of the room, a figure stood. It was humanoid, its features obscured by a long, black cloak that billowed like a shadow. But its face, its eyes, were glowing a sickly red, burning with an unnatural light. As it stepped forward, the walls seemed to ripple with its movement, the shelves of books shifting as though alive. The thing reached out its hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and pointed directly at Maggie. "Join us, Maggie Everett. Join us on our eternal voyage." The darkness swallowed her whole. Maggie's breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest as the figure's red eyes glowed brighter, burning through the darkness like twin beacons of terror. She backed away slowly, her legs shaking with the weight of fear, but the shadows around her seemed to follow every movement, blocking her escape. She turned to look behind her. The walls had shifted again. The narrow passage she had entered through was gone. The room had expanded, grown more cavernous, its ceiling stretching higher than before. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very ship was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. Every inch of it screamed of death, of forgotten horrors, of a twisted, never-ending voyage. The figure in front of her moved closer, its long, gaunt form gliding effortlessly over the floor. Its footsteps were silent, but the heavy, suffocating air seemed to thicken with each step it took. "Join us, Maggie," the figure whispered again, its voice a cold, soulless echo in the depths of her mind. "Your name is already written in the ship's log. Your place is here, forever." Maggie could feel the weight of its words pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, crushing any resistance she had left. Her body trembled violently, and she could no longer tell if the cold creeping into her bones was from the ship or from the terror that was coursing through her veins. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers now mere inches from her skin. A cold, unnatural gust of wind hit her like a slap, and the room seemed to distort before her eyes. The walls swayed, bending, as if the very structure of the ship was twisting, warping, and pulling her into its dark heart. "No!" Maggie screamed, her voice hoarse from the fear tightening in her throat. She stumbled backward, desperate, but the shadows seemed to press closer, suffocating her, dragging her back toward the thing with the burning eyes. "You can't escape, Maggie," the figure hissed, its voice now rising to a sinister, mocking tone. "The ship has already claimed you. You are part of it now, a passenger on its eternal voyage." Suddenly, the room was alive with the sound of creaking metal, the ship groaning in protest, as if it were awakening from a long slumber. The very floor beneath Maggie's feet seemed to shift, sending a jolt of terror through her. She couldn't run, couldn't hide. There was nowhere left to go. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then went out. In the pitch-black darkness, Maggie's senses were overwhelmed. She could hear the soft, muted whispers, the shuffling of footsteps, and the slow, deliberate dragging of chains. Then, like a horrible dream, the silence was broken by an ear-piercing, shrieking sound, the sound of metal scraping against metal. Something cold wrapped around her ankle. Her body jerked, and she screamed in panic, her hands clawing at the air as she was yanked backward. It was like being dragged into the depths of the ocean, swallowed whole by the ship, her body pulled away from everything she knew. Her nails scraped the floor, her fingers trying desperately to grip the now slick, wet surface. But the ship was too strong. She felt herself plummeting, faster, deeper, into something she couldn't see. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, her breath quickening as panic set in. The ship was dragging her into its belly, its dark, infinite maw ready to consume her. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. Maggie's body was weightless, suspended in complete, suffocating silence. Her body was no longer her own. She was aware of the ship, of its endless corridors, of its passengers, all of them. They were with her now. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, the faces of the lost, the damned, the ship's twisted souls. She could hear them, the chorus of the damned singing their eternal hymn. Join us forever. A soft, persistent voice whispered in her ear, growing louder and louder, filling her head with unbearable pressure. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the ship's ancient curse pulling at her very soul. And then she understood. The ship was not just a vessel, it was alive. It had lived for centuries, carried the souls of the dead across the waves of the ocean to places unknown. It thrived on those who boarded it. Those who dared to enter its haunted, twisted halls were never truly free again. They became part of its crew, its eternal passengers. And now Maggie was one of them. Her eyes snapped open, the room around her shifting and stretching, warping into something incomprehensible. She wasn't alone. The passengers, ghosts, shadows, twisted faces stood around her. They were the ones who had disappeared years ago. Those who had entered the ship like her and never left. They were all here, in this suffocating void, trapped for eternity. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, sending a jolt through her spine. "Welcome aboard," a voice whispered, rough and cracked. Maggie looked to the side, her stomach lurching as she saw the hollowed-out face of a man, his eyes glowing red. It was the captain, the one who had once stood at the helm of the ship, now a mere shadow of what he had been. The walls of the room shifted, folding and collapsing into new shapes. Maggie could hear the ship groan, the sound of its ancient machinery working, the sounds of the crew, long dead, still performing their duties in the dark. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, a grand, ornate mirror stood. It reflected nothing but darkness, but Maggie could feel its power, pulling her in. The voices, the whispers grew louder, urging her to step closer. As she did, she saw it, her own reflection. But it wasn't her. It was the woman she had been, smiling, alive, but the eyes were different. They were cold, empty. And behind her, she could see the endless ocean, a sea of darkness, stretching as far as the eye could see. She wasn't herself anymore. She was part of the ship, part of its crew, part of its endless voyage. And the mirror showed her truth, forever. The ship would never let her go. Maggie was one of the lost now, one of the damned. She had joined the eternal voyage. Story number 2. Maya had always prided herself on being a woman who balanced skepticism and curiosity. As a high-powered corporate lawyer, she was accustomed to being logical and rational, evaluating every situation through a filter of facts and reason. But even the most rational people have their limits, and today, her limit was being tested. It began with an unexpected delivery. A sleek black envelope arrived at her office, sealed with a deep crimson wax stamp. It was starkly different from the usual pile of legal documents or mundane bills that cluttered her desk. Her assistant had left it on her chair without a word, and as Maya picked it up, she immediately felt a strange chill in the air. Who could this be from? There was no return address, only her name inscribed in elegant script on the front. She turned it over and found no sign of the sender. With a mix of curiosity and a growing sense of unease, she slid her finger under the seal, breaking it gently. Inside there was a beautifully crafted pamphlet, its pages glossy and thick, filled with opulent images of a tropical paradise. She gasped as her eyes scanned the brochure. Luxurious, private beachfront villas, lush gardens, and serene spa facilities. Everything was bathed in a golden glow, like something out of a dream. The words that followed were equally enticing. Experience true rejuvenation at the Skin Takers Resort, where your beauty is restored, your vitality reborn. A weekend of rest and relaxation awaits you. Leave the stress behind and step into a new version of yourself. The brochure also included a personal invitation, handwritten in flowing ink. Dear Maya, the respite you seek is not far away. Come to us and allow us to show you the rejuvenating power of our treatments. We promise you will leave as your best self. We look forward to welcoming you soon. She read the invitation twice, but no matter how many times she scanned it, her mind couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about it. There was no address, no specific details, but the allure of the resort was undeniable. Rejuvenation, restoration, beauty. These words clung to her like a siren's call. At 33, Maya had noticed the first signs of aging creeping into her life. A few faint lines near her eyes, a small, persistent tiredness that had begun to follow her. The pressure of her job had left her looking worn, almost drained at times. She felt it deeply after years of endless hours in meetings, long flights, and constant legal battles. Her body was beginning to protest. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, and more than anything, she longed to escape it all for a while. Maybe this is exactly what I need, she thought. But there was a small voice, faint but insistent, that nagged at the back of her mind. What's the catch? Why is there no contact information? Maya pushed the questions aside. She had worked herself into the ground for years. A luxurious getaway in a tropical paradise, far from the bustle of her demanding career, seemed like the perfect opportunity to reset her mind and body. If it was truly as good as the brochure promised, it would be worth it. Even if there was something off about the lack of details, she was certain she'd have a good time. The brochures didn't lie, right? Still, an unsettling thought lingered as she reached for her phone and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the pamphlet. A soft, almost mechanical voice greeted her on the other end. The Skin Takers Resort. How may we assist you, Ms. Foster? Hello, yes, Maya replied, trying to shake the uneasy feeling still gnawing at her. I received an invitation, and I'd like to inquire about booking a stay. Of course, Ms. Foster, the voice responded smoothly. We've been expecting you. Your room is already prepared. Shall I go ahead and reserve your spot for this weekend? Maya blinked. The ease of the conversation felt too smooth, almost too rehearsed. How could they have been expecting her? She hadn't even confirmed anything yet, but she shook off the thought. After all, they were offering exactly what she needed. A break. The stress of her city life had become suffocating, and she could feel her body rebelling against the relentless pace. It was time to unplug, even if she had to surrender a little trust to do it. Yes, please, she said, taking a deep breath to steady herself. I'll take the spot. When do I need to arrive? Your limousine will be waiting for you at the dock at 5 p.m. tomorrow, the voice replied promptly. We'll make sure everything is arranged for you upon arrival. Thank you, Maya said, hanging up the phone. She stared at it for a moment longer, then glanced at the brochure again. The images of sun-kissed beaches, turquoise waters, and perfectly manicured gardens beckoned her. Tomorrow. She quickly packed a small bag and arranged for a flight out of the city. The nagging doubts in her mind had all but disappeared, replaced by the eagerness of escape. The resort would offer what she craved: relaxation, rejuvenation, a chance to restore her body and mind. And so, the next day, as the plane descended toward a tiny, unmarked airstrip that led to the private island where the Skin Takers Resort was located, Maya couldn't help but smile to herself. Everything about this place was perfect, almost too perfect. The limo would be waiting for her, and her new life was about to begin. Maya could hardly contain her excitement as the sleek limousine sped down the long, winding road towards the resort. The island was a secluded paradise, hidden from the bustling world she had left behind. Tall palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, their fronds shimmering under the soft glow of the setting sun. The air was rich with the scent of salt water and flowers. The the kind of place she'd only read about in glossy magazines. It was everything the brochure had promised: luxurious, tranquil, untouched by time. As the limo approached the resort, the sight of it took her breath away. The Skin Takers Resort was unlike any place she had ever seen. Towering modern buildings, with glass walls blended seamlessly with the lush greenery surrounding them, creating an atmosphere of elegance and serenity. The entire complex seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, the sunlight casting long, warm shadows that made the whole place seem almost ethereal. The car slowed as it entered the resort's grand entrance, a vast archway adorned with creeping ivy and vibrant flowers. There were no signs of other guests, only the soft murmur of waves crashing against the shore. Maya felt an eerie sense of calm wash over her, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right returned. She brushed it off, eager to begin her rejuvenating escape. As she stepped out of the limo, she was immediately greeted by a staff member, a man dressed in a sharp white uniform that seemed to gleam under the tropical sun. He smiled warmly at her, his perfectly groomed appearance matching the resort's pristine surroundings. There was an air of perfection in everything, from his stiff posture to his flawless demeanor. "Welcome, Ms. Foster," he said, his voice smooth and soothing. "We've been expecting you. If you'll follow me, we'll take you to your private villa." Maya followed him with a mixture of curiosity and relief. The resort was everything she'd imagined, luxury in every detail, from the scent of exotic flowers to the sound of gentle music playing softly in the background. But still, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered just at the edge of her consciousness. They walked through beautifully manicured gardens, the path lined with flowers that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The air grew cooler as they entered a large, open courtyard where tall, cascading waterfalls fed into sparkling pools of water. Maya felt a sense of calm beginning to settle within her, the weight of the world she had left behind beginning to lift. It was everything she had hoped for. The staff member led her through a large stone archway, and before her stood a villa that could only be described as paradise. It was perched on the edge of a cliff, offering sweeping views of the ocean below. The villa's walls were made of smooth white stone, and large floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a tastefully decorated interior. Plush furniture, a king-size bed draped in silk, and a bathroom that appeared to be carved into the stone itself. All of it was perfect. "Your stay will be as comfortable as possible, Ms. Foster," the staff member said. "Feel free to explore the grounds or indulge in any treatments you desire. Your personal attendant will be at your service." Maya felt a wave of gratitude and exhaustion. It had been a long day of traveling, and the serenity of her villa was exactly what she needed. She thanked the staff member and closed the door behind her, finally able to unwind. As she sank into the plush chair by the window, she gazed out at the ocean, listening to the gentle hum of the waves. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. The unsettling feeling, however, would not go away. It seemed to be embedded in the very air around her, like the subtle, constant buzz of a forgotten alarm. Later that evening, Maya decided to indulge in one of the spa treatments she had been told so much about. She had been given a pamphlet listing various therapies: massages, facials, skin treatments, and even some more unusual offerings like body wraps and energy cleansing. Each treatment was designed to restore balance and rejuvenate the spirit. The descriptions were vague but enticing. As she approached the spa's entrance, a sense of foreboding crept over her again, but she shrugged it off. There was no reason for her to feel this way. She needed to relax, and what better way than a calming massage after her long journey? Inside, the spa was everything she had expected, dimly lit, with smooth stone floors and the faint scent of lavender wafting through the air. Soft, ambient music played in the background, and the atmosphere was overwhelmingly peaceful. An attendant greeted her, a young woman with a serene smile. "Ms. Foster, we are so glad you've chosen to visit our spa," she said, her voice almost hypnotic. "Tonight we recommend the renewal ritual. It is our signature treatment. You'll feel the years peel away." Maya smiled, feeling both intrigued and slightly nervous. "Sounds amazing. Let's do it." The attendant led her to a private room with a large plush massage table. The lighting was low, and the air felt cool as she slipped out of her clothes and settled under a soft blanket. She closed her eyes, trying to relax, but the feeling of unease persisted, like an invisible hand gripping her chest. She took deep breaths, determined to enjoy this experience and finally let go of her stress. As the attendant began her work, Maya felt herself slowly drifting into a relaxed state. The soothing strokes and pressure on her back felt therapeutic, almost magical, as if the tension was melting away. She let out a soft sigh of relief. But as the massage continued, something strange began to happen. The room seemed to shift. The light dimmed even further, and the music, which had been soft and calming, now played an unsettling, discordant melody. Maya felt her body grow colder, her limbs stiffening as though the relaxation was draining from her veins. She opened her eyes, confused. The attendant had paused in her work, standing at the edge of the bed, her hands still outstretched toward Maya. Her smile had disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Is everything okay?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. The attendant didn't respond. Instead, she reached down and pressed her hand gently onto Maya's shoulder, sending a cold shiver through her spine. For a brief moment, Maya felt the air shift in the room, and the sensation of something wrong filled her. The sensation of fingers brushing against her skin felt too unnatural. Suddenly, there was a sharp tug, like something being pulled from her. The world seemed to go dark around her as the light flickered and hummed. And then it was as if the attendant was no longer there. Maya bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around wildly, but the room was empty. She was alone. The massage table was covered in smooth white sheets, but they looked different. There were strange, faint marks on the surface, like fingerprints that had been smeared with something dark. The air felt thick and heavy, the silence in the room oppressive. She could hear her own breathing now, shallow and fast. "Maya, calm down," she told herself. "You're just tired. It's just the exhaustion getting to you." But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She stood up, shaky, her legs weak from the strange experience, and grabbed her robe. She glanced at the mirror. She looked different. Her skin appeared smoother, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes were brighter. Her reflection seemed off, as if it didn't fully match her image, but there was no time to dwell on it. She quickly left the spa, her nerves on edge, and made her way back to her villa, hoping that sleep would help clear her mind. Little did she know, the real treatment had only just begun. Maya woke in the middle of the night, her body drenched in sweat. Her skin, which had felt so soft and rejuvenated just hours earlier, now tingled with an odd, uncomfortable sensation. Like something was crawling beneath the surface. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed. The room bathed in a dim, eerie light from the moon that slipped through the partially open window. The gentle sway of the palm trees outside made it seem like the world beyond her room was still and at peace. But within, the air felt thick and oppressive. She tried to shake off the discomfort, blaming it on the strange massage. Maybe it had been too much, too soon, or perhaps the stress of the journey was catching up with her. But something inside her told her it was more than just that. Something about the spa, the attendants, and the luxurious resort felt wrong, like a facade designed to lull her into a false sense of security. She glanced at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. Unable to fall back to sleep, Maya decided to get up and explore the villa, hoping that a little walk would help clear her mind. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she stepped into the dark hallway that connected the rooms. The air was cooler in the hallway, and the house seemed unnervingly silent. She reached the large arched window at the end of the corridor, which framed a perfect view of the ocean. The moonlight painted the water a silver sheen, almost too perfect, as if the whole scene were a painted backdrop. Something caught her eye, a faint shadow moving across the yard just outside the window. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but the shadow seemed to glide effortlessly across the courtyard, disappearing behind one of the villa's columns. Her breath hitched in her throat. What was that? Her instincts told her to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. But curiosity, mingled with a growing sense of dread, pulled her toward the window. She stepped closer to peer outside. But the moment she did, the figure reappeared again, this time closer. It was a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long wet hair cascading over her shoulders. She moved with an unnatural grace, walking toward the villa as if she had no care for the world around her. Her steps were silent, her presence almost ghostly. The wind seemed to swirl around her, as if it were bending to her will. Maya's breath caught in her throat. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the woman moved, the way she glided without sound, like a specter rather than a living person. Before Maya could react, the woman turned and locked eyes with her through the window. Her gaze was intense, almost hypnotic, and Maya felt a chill race down her spine. The woman didn't smile, but her eyes, those eyes, seemed to pierce right through her, as if she were looking directly into her soul. Maya froze, unable to move or look away. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then, as quickly as it had started, the woman disappeared into the darkness, vanishing as if she had never been there. Maya blinked rapidly, her heart racing. She backed away from the window, her mind reeling. The shadows in the room seemed to press in on her, closing in tighter with each passing second. Her pulse hammered in her ears and her hands were clammy. Was I imagining things? She wondered, struggling to steady her breath. The woman had been real, but she didn't belong here. She couldn't have. Her mind raced as she tried to rationalize what she'd seen. She had to be tired, exhausted even. After all, it was the middle of the night, and she had just arrived at the resort. She must have been seeing things, or maybe the stress was getting to her. It was the kind of thing she had read about in horror stories. The mind playing tricks when it's tired, or when fear starts to take hold. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That someone, or something, was watching her. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. There was no need to panic. She was just tired. She would get some rest and forget about it in the morning. But as she turned to return to her bed, she noticed something out of place. The door to her walk-in closet was slightly ajar. Maya frowned, remembering that she had closed it earlier. She didn't think she'd opened it since then. The hair on the back of her neck prickled as she walked toward the closet. She knew it was ridiculous to be scared. She had been the one to close it after all, but something about the way it was left open unsettled her. Maya pushed the door fully open, expecting to find nothing but her neatly hung clothes. But when the door creaked open, she gasped. The room inside was completely different. Where there had once been only clothes, now there was a dark, narrow passage. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each breath Maya took. The air in the passage was thick, heavy, and warm, like something long forgotten had just been unearthed. It felt ancient, a place that had been sealed away for a reason. A muffled sound reached her ears, a faint scratching, like fingernails on wood, coming from deep within the darkness. Maya's heart raced as she stared into the abyss of the passage. She took a step back, but then something caught her attention, the floor of the closet. There in the corner was a patch of skin, a small human patch of skin, pink and fresh, lying discarded on the floor. Maya recoiled in horror, a scream caught in her throat. Before she could move, she felt a chill creep up her spine, as if someone was standing right behind her. She spun around, expecting to see the woman from earlier, but the room was empty. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her breath was shallow, her pulse erratic. She could feel her mind spiraling. She had to get out of here. She had to leave the villa, leave the resort, leave this nightmare behind. But as she turned toward the door, she froze in place. The hallway outside was no longer the hallway she had left. It had changed. The walls were darker, the floorboards creaked more eerily than before, and the entire hallway seemed to stretch impossibly far. The only light came from the distant end of the hall, where a faint, flickering glow beckoned her. And then she heard it, a soft whisper, as if someone was calling her name. Maya! Maya! She shuddered, every instinct telling her to run, to flee, to escape this place that was suffocating her. But instead she found herself walking toward the whisper, drawn in by an invisible force that gnawed at her very being. No, she thought. I have to get out. But when she reached the end of the hallway, there was nowhere to go. The hallway continued on, and Maya realized she was trapped. Maya's breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the situation. The hallway stretched before her like a nightmarish labyrinth, and with each step she took, the air grew colder. The dim light at the end of the corridor pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing her in. But a deeper primal fear warned her to stay back. She turned around, fully expecting to see the passageway behind her change, but the hallway was still the same, just as silent and suffocating as it had been moments before. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with an unseen presence that made her skin crawl. "Get out of here, Maya!" Now her feet moved on their own accord, drawn toward the light at the end of the hall. She tried to fight it, but the whispering call, her name carried on a breath of wind, compelled her forward. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling her into a deep pit, where escape would be impossible. The moment she reached the end, the faint glow turned into a sickly yellow light, casting a ghastly pallor over everything it touched. The walls of the hallway seemed to melt, their edges blurring like wet paint, and before she could fully process what was happening, the corridor opened up into an enormous, cavernous space that shouldn't have existed. It was a grand spa area, lavish and serene, with marble floors, ornate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and plush velvet chairs lining the walls. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something metallic. This place had no business existing. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen, her wide eyes darting from one corner of the room to the next. It looked like the resort's luxurious spa, but it felt wrong, like it had been warped by something ancient, something monstrous. But what caught Maya's attention, more than the eerie beauty of the space, was the figure standing at the center of the room. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had glided across the yard like a ghost. She was no longer wearing the flowing white gown, but stood now in a sleek, tight-fitting black dress. Her features were sharper, more defined, her skin unnaturally smooth and glowing. She was still young, too young, but her eyes, those dark, unnerving eyes, seemed to pierce through Maya like daggers. "Welcome to the heart of the resort," the woman said, her voice a velvety whisper that seemed to echo through the empty space. "I trust you're feeling rejuvenated?" Maya opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was frozen, unable to tear her gaze away from the woman. Something about her was hypnotic, as if every word and every gesture was designed to ensnare her. The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill crawling up Maya's spine. What is this place?" Maya managed to whisper, her voice shaking. The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A sanctuary, a refuge for those seeking escape. You wanted rejuvenation, didn't you? To leave behind the old and become something new, something perfect." She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floor. "I can give you that. I can make you whole again." Maya felt a shudder of disgust ripple through her. "No, you've done something to me. My skin, it's beautiful," the woman interrupted, her voice lilting with a sickening sweetness. "You're already beginning to change, just as you should. Your body will become pure, untouched by the ravages of time, and you will never feel pain again." Maya's hands flew to her face, her fingers grazing the smoothness of her skin. It felt too smooth, too flawless, like it didn't belong to her. She pulled her fingers away quickly, her heart racing. "No, this isn't me. This can't be real." The woman took another step toward her, and before Maya could move, her hand was on her arm, cool and firm. She felt the woman's touch spread through her body like a jolt of energy, or maybe something more sinister. Her skin prickled, and a sharp pain shot up her arm. It was a dull ache, but it was growing, spreading. Maya gasped and tried to pull away, but the woman held her in place with an iron grip. "Don't fight it, Maya," she whispered. "This is the beginning. This is what you were meant for." Suddenly, the air around her seemed to pulse, and the room shifted. The marble floors turned to soft earth beneath her feet, and the walls dissolved into a fog that pressed in from all sides. There was a deep rumble, an ancient sound that vibrated through her bones. Maya screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the thickening air. And then she felt it, the true horror. Her skin, the skin that had felt so soft and new, began to pull. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if something was digging beneath the surface, shifting and rearranging her very flesh. Her hands shot up to her arms, to her neck, to her face. But it was too late. She felt her flesh stretch and peel, something unseen pulling it away, layer by layer. It wasn't just the surface. It was as if the essence of her skin was being taken, as though the woman was harvesting her very being. "No!" Maya screamed, stumbling back. She tried to pull away, but her body felt as though it was becoming a part of the space, a part of the nightmare that surrounded her. The woman's laughter rang in her ears, chilling and dark. But it wasn't just the woman who laughed. The entire room seemed to join in, an unsettling chorus of voices all echoing the same eerie tune. Maya collapsed onto the floor, clutching her stomach, feeling the unmistakable sensation of skin being pulled from her, of her being torn apart. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached toward the door, but the moment she touched the door frame, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. Her screams were muffled, swallowed up by the thick walls of the room, the walls covered with something familiar. Flesh. Past victims' flesh. The walls seemed to pulse, ripples moving through the skin that clung to them. The room was alive, alive with something that fed on her, on them. Maya's vision blurred as she looked at the walls one last time and saw the horrific truth. The flesh, the skin, it had been harvested from others before her. The woman wasn't just some strange, elegant figure. She was a parasite, an entity that lived through the suffering of others, each harvest making her stronger, more human. Maya understood then. The resort wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap, and she was its next victim. Maya's breath quickened as the last vestiges of her strength ebbed away. The room was growing darker, the once soft glow from the chandeliers now reduced to flickering, sickly light. The sound of distant murmurs echoed throughout the space, whispers from the other lost souls who had fallen victim to the entity's endless harvest. Her skin, a grotesque, raw layer of flesh that seemed foreign to her, pulsed and writhed as if it were no longer truly hers. The sensation of the woman's hands on her, peeling away the very essence of her being, had left her numb, but now the numbness was turning into an excruciating, mind-shattering pain. Maya's body twisted and contorted as her skin continued to change, stretching and warping like something not human at all. She could feel the walls closing in, pressing against her chest, the flesh of the past victims surrounding her, clinging to her as though trying to drag her into the same fate. Her screams had long since faded into silence, her voice lost in the suffocating air. "No, I can't," she whispered, barely able to speak, her voice strained and hoarse. But the woman, the entity, was already there, standing over her with that knowing, satisfied smile. She looked down at Maya, her eyes dark and predatory. The woman's form was beginning to change too. Her skin, flawless and smooth, shimmered in the dim light. But Maya saw the telltale signs of something more sinister beneath. The woman was shifting, her face melting into something more monstrous with every passing second. The elegance was gone, replaced by a creature that thrived on the torment of others, its very existence bound to the flesh of its victims. "You were perfect," the woman cooed, kneeling next to Maya. "So pure, so ripe for the taking." Maya's vision blurred, but there was one thing she still could do, one thing left. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the only thing she still had left, her phone. It had been shattered earlier, but the screen still worked, just enough to show a distorted reflection of her own face. Her expression was unrecognizable, a patchwork of torn skin and bloody flesh. But in her eyes there was still a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who had once thought she could escape this nightmare. With trembling hands, she swiped across the screen, searching for the number she never thought she would need to dial. A single tear slipped from her eye as she pressed the button. "Help," she whispered. "Please, help me." But the phone's screen faded into static. the call never going through. The woman laughed, a cruel, chilling sound that made Maya's blood run cold. There is no one coming, my dear. No one can save you now, not when you're mine. Maya's mind reeled with desperation, but there was no escape. No place left to run. Her body, already twisting and changing, was no longer hers to control. The skin, the flesh, it was the entity's now. The resort had claimed her, just as it had claimed countless others. With a final, gut-wrenching scream, Maya collapsed to the floor. Her body spasmed as her final breath escaped her lips. The transformation complete. The woman, now a grotesque, writhing being of flesh and decay, smiled in triumph. She had taken another soul, another piece of humanity to feed her hunger. And as the resort's walls shifted and writhed with the energy of the new harvest, Maya's screams echoed once more, this time joining the chorus of those who had been lost before her. In the closing, Maya's fate is sealed as she succumbs to the horrors of the resort. The woman, the entity, now has complete control, leaving no room for escape or salvation. The resort continues its grim operation, a twisted sanctuary for those who sought rejuvenation, but were instead devoured by its unholy hunger. Story number 3. The morning fog clung to the mountain peaks like a heavy blanket, the cold air biting at the hikers' skin as they made their way through the dense forest. The trail had become rougher as they ascended, the once clear path now a winding mess of roots and rocks. Despite their growing fatigue, the hikers pushed forward, eager to reach the summit before nightfall. Just a little farther, Matt, the leader of the group, called out, looking back over his shoulder. His voice echoed through the trees, though none of the others responded. They had been walking for hours, their energy sapped by the demanding terrain. I think we should stop for a break, Emily, one of the hikers said, panting as she wiped sweat from her brow. It's getting harder to keep up. Matt glanced at her, his face a mixture of concern and determination. They had come all this way. Stopping now would delay their plans, and none of them wanted to lose momentum. We're almost there, he said, his voice firm but gentle. The group of 5 hikers, Matt, Emily, Lucas, Sarah, and Owen, had been planning this trip for months. They were seasoned hikers, accustomed to the challenges of high-altitude trails. But this expedition was different. They had ventured far off the beaten path, looking for something remote, something untouched. They had heard rumors of an ancient mountain village that had long been forgotten, a place where time seemed to stand still. The promise of discovering this hidden gem had excited them. As they trudged forward, the fog thickened, enveloping the group in a dense, suffocating haze. The air grew colder, and the familiar sounds of the forest fell silent. For a moment, it felt as though the world had disappeared, leaving only the hikers and the mountain. Is anyone else feeling weird? Lucas asked, his voice low as he looked around nervously. It's like the air's getting heavier. Yeah, Emily replied, glancing over at Sarah. It's like the fog's pressing down on us. Owen, who had been leading the way with Matt, suddenly stopped and held up a hand. Guys, look! In the distance, barely visible through the thick fog, stood a cluster of stone cottages. The village appeared abandoned, the buildings sagging and weathered, as though no one had lived there for decades. But something about it didn't seem quite right. The village felt too quiet. There were no signs of life, no animals, no movement of any kind. Is this it? Emily asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Is this the village we've been hearing about? I think so, Matt said, nodding. Let's check it out. The group descended the slope toward the village, their steps growing heavier as they drew nearer. The air became colder still, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel path. The houses were small, almost cottage-like in appearance, with dark wooden beams and thatched roofs. There was no sign of smoke rising from chimneys, no lights in the windows, no indication that anyone was home. It was as though the village had been frozen in time, a relic of an age long past. When they reached the first cottage, a heavy wooden door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, her thin, wrinkled face framed by long white hair. Her eyes gleamed with a strange intensity as she looked at them, her lips curving into a smile. "Welcome," she said, her voice raspy but warm. "You've arrived just in time for the festival." The hikers exchanged glances, unsure of what she meant. "Festival?" Matt asked, stepping forward cautiously. "We weren't expecting anything like that." "Oh yes," the woman replied, her smile widening. "The festival. It's a special occasion. You're the guests of honor after all." The hikers hesitated. The woman's welcome was warm, but something about her tone was unsettling. She didn't seem surprised to see them, almost as if she had been expecting them all along. And the fact that she was alone in this remote village, surrounded by empty cottages, made them feel uneasy. "We don't want to trouble you," Matt said, glancing back at the group. "We were just hoping to rest for a while before heading back down." The woman's smile never faltered. "Rest? You've come a long way. You're welcome to stay for the festival. We have food, music, and plenty of hospitality to offer. It's the least we can do for travelers like yourselves." The offer was tempting, but Matt was wary. Something about the village felt wrong, but he didn't want to seem rude, especially when the woman was so insistent. "All right," he said, glancing at the others. "We'll stay for a bit, but we'll be on our way soon." The woman stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in. You'll find the feast awaiting you." As the group stepped into the dimly lit cottage, the air seemed to thicken, the shadows growing deeper with each step. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the wood and stained with dark markings. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow casting eerie shapes on the walls. A long table was set in the center of the room, covered with an array of mouth-watering dishes. Roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables, and fruits. The aroma was intoxicating, and despite the unease creeping at the back of their minds, the hikers couldn't help but feel hungry. "You've been traveling for so long," the woman said, as she set a large platter of roasted meat before them. "You must be starving. Eat, please. This is a feast to honor the mountain." The group exchanged uncertain glances, but, unable to resist the tantalizing smell, they sat down. They began to eat, the flavors rich and savory, filling their mouths with a warmth that they hadn't realized they had been missing. But as the meal progressed, a growing sense of discomfort lingered. The meat, though delicious, seemed too tender, too perfectly cooked. The more they ate, the heavier their stomachs became, and the more their sense of unease grew. Matt noticed the others were eating in silence, their faces pale, eyes glazed over as if in a trance. When Matt reached for another piece of meat, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The flesh on his plate, though perfectly cooked, looked too familiar, too human. He froze. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and the world seemed to tilt around him. The meat wasn't from a pig or a cow or any animal. It was human. But before he could voice his horror, the woman's voice broke through the fog of his panic. "You've been so gracious eating our offering," she said, her smile widening. "It's time for you to join us. The festival is about to begin." The table fell into an eerie silence as the realization struck each of them like a wave of ice water. Their hearts raced and their eyes darted nervously around the room. They had been eating human flesh. The woman's eyes gleamed with an unsettling satisfaction as she watched their reactions. "You see," she said softly, "this is the way it's always been. Every year we honor the mountain. Every year new guests arrive to partake in the feast." The hikers scrambled to their feet, but as they stood, they realized the door was no longer open. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the very walls were closing in around them. The windows were shut tight, and the fire in the hearth burned brighter, casting flickering shadows on the walls. You've been eating people?" Emily's voice trembled as she took a step back. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes, my dear. The mountain demands sacrifice. It is the way of things." Matt's mind raced. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. The other villagers, who had been sitting in the shadows, now stood up one by one, their faces twisted in anticipation. They too were smiling, hungry smiles, eyes gleaming with a dark, insatiable hunger. You must understand, the woman continued, her voice soft and melodic. The mountain demands what is due, and now it is your turn. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet rumbled, a low growl that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. The villagers moved closer, encircling the hikers. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent energy as they reached for the hikers, their hands outstretched, eager to claim their prize. But before they could react, the doors of the cottage slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Terrifying twist. As they struggled against the tightening grip of the villagers, Matt's eyes locked on the doorway. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of a giant mountain deity, a monstrous, grotesque creature, its eyes burning with fiery hatred. The villagers chanted in unison, their voices rising in a crescendo of eerie devotion as the mountain god's figure took form. "Join us, travelers," the woman whispered, her voice now a guttural growl. "The feast has begun." The night stretched on, the fire crackling low in the hearth as the villagers continued to eat with a disturbing sense of ritual. The food, beautifully prepared, laced with exotic spices and gleaming under the candlelight, was consumed with almost religious fervor, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the fire. But the hikers, still at the table, felt the world growing colder by the second, despite the flames before them. Samantha stared at her plate, unable to take another bite, but too afraid to look away. The flesh on her plate seemed to stare back, its texture too human, too real. The smell of the meat, the rich, overpowering aroma, was beginning to make her feel dizzy. She couldn't stomach it anymore, but there was an unsettling compulsion in the air, as if the very walls of the cottage were urging them to eat. She pushed her plate away, her stomach rebelling. But the villagers, with their twisted grins and unblinking eyes, noticed. "You must finish," the old man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's part of the ceremony." The hairs on the back of Samantha's neck stood on end. She glanced around the room. Her friends, her fellow hikers, most of them were still eating, seemingly oblivious to the disturbing reality of what they were consuming. Their faces were flushed, their movements erratic, almost as if they were hypnotized by the food. Some were eating with tears in their eyes, while others grinned, as though nothing in the world could make them stop. The room grew colder still, and Samantha's breath came out in shallow bursts, her hands trembling uncontrollably as her body reacted to the mounting dread. And then, just as she was about to speak, she saw it. A face she recognized, one of the missing hikers from a previous group. Their skin was pale, drawn tight across their skull, the eyes wide and empty. The face of the person she had last seen alive sitting next to her at breakfast. The others didn't seem to notice the figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the firelight. But Samantha did. It was staring at her, its face twisted in a grotesque, silent scream. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence sent a wave of terror rushing through her. The old man's voice cut through her thoughts, thick with a grim satisfaction. "Some guests linger longer than others," he said softly. "The feast must continue. We will make sure you feel at home before the end." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the world around her seemed to spin. The figure, now joined by others, familiar faces of hikers she had never seen before, all with empty, lifeless eyes, surrounded the table. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her limbs were frozen in place. "You should join them," the old man whispered. As the last of the food was consumed, the villagers began to chant. A low, rhythmic chant that felt as though it had been passed down through generations. No, through centuries. The sound of their voices blended with the cracking of the fire, and the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. Samantha could feel the earth beneath her feet beginning to tremble. And then it happened. The ground seemed to open beneath them, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of the building. But it wasn't the house settling, it was something else. Something ancient, alive, and hungry. "Do you hear it?" The old man's voice was tinged with madness now. "It calls for more." The air thickened with the smell of decay. and Samantha looked down to see the floorboards cracking open, revealing a swirling mass of darkness. The darkness pulsed like a living entity, and from it, something ancient, something terrible, began to rise. A loud thud shook the ground, and the walls of the cottage seemed to bend in toward them. The shadows on the walls danced, reaching out like fingers, stretching, growing. "Come now, it's time," the old man crooned, his face twisted in a sickening grin. "We'll all be part of the mountain soon." And as the shadows crept closer and the guests around her grew still, their eyes glazed over with the same hollow emptiness that Samantha had seen on the figure in the corner. The terror sank in deeper. As the hours passed, the hikers began to realize that there was no way out. The doors of the cottage remained locked, and no matter how hard they banged against the walls or shouted for help, there was no response from the outside world. Their minds raced, but the sinking feeling in their stomachs grew heavier with each passing minute. The villagers moved about in silence, their eyes fixed on the massive table at the center of the room. The air was thick with the scent of spices, herbs, and something far more sinister. And as the moon began to rise high above the mountain, casting an eerie glow through the small windows, the tension in the cottage grew unbearable. The head villager, an old man with sunken eyes and a face marred by deep wrinkles, approached the group. His smile was wide and unnerving, as though he knew the horrific truth that had begun to dawn on the hikers. He spoke in a low, soothing tone, but his words were anything but comforting. "The feast must begin," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient. "The mountain has waited long enough." Before any of them could react, the villagers moved in unison, silently ushering the hikers to the long wooden table. The meat, already carved and prepared, was piled high, the glistening cuts of flesh almost too perfect to be real. The hikers stared at the food, their stomachs turning as they noticed something off about it. The texture, the way it shimmered under the candlelight, the unnerving way it seemed to pulse as though it were alive. "You must eat," the old man insisted, his voice growing more insistent. To refuse would bring anger to the mountain. Terror gripped their hearts, but hunger and exhaustion made it difficult to think clearly. And despite their fear, the aroma of the meat was overwhelming, rich, savory, and intoxicating. They reached for their plates instinctively, though deep down they knew something was terribly wrong. Samantha, the last to take her seat, hesitated for a moment before picking up a piece of meat. Her hand trembled as she held it up to her mouth, but her mind seemed to cloud over. She opened her mouth and took a bite. The moment the meat touched her tongue, her senses went haywire. It was unlike anything she'd ever tasted before. Succulent, tender, almost sweet, but with an underlying bitterness that made her stomach lurch. She swallowed, but her throat tightened, and her pulse quickened. Around her, the others had already begun eating too, oblivious to the subtle change in their own bodies. They devoured the food with desperate hunger, not realizing they were digging their own graves. Suddenly, Samantha felt it, a sharp, gnawing pain in her chest. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The walls of the cottage seemed to close in on her as her vision blurred. Her skin prickled, and her heart pounded painfully in her chest. Something was terribly wrong. The meat, the food, it was... A sickening realization washed over her. The screams from the others pierced the silence. It wasn't food. It wasn't meat. The pieces they'd been eating, now clearly human flesh, had been taken from those who'd disappeared before them. Her eyes darted around the room, but the world around her seemed to warp and twist as she fought for control over her body. The villagers continued eating, their faces grotesquely delighted, oblivious to the agony in their guests' eyes. And that's when the true horror began. The room spun, and Samantha struggled to focus as the world around her warped into a nightmarish blur. Her vision was clouded with black spots, her body aching as though the life was being drained from her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was trapped in her own body, her mind screaming for escape but unable to act. Then the walls began to tremble. At first it was a low rumble, almost like the echo of distant thunder, but it grew louder, more intense. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shake, as though the mountain itself were alive, angry. And that's when the doors to the cottage slammed shut with an ear-splitting crash. The villagers didn't seem to notice. They were too consumed with the ritual, too lost in their madness. Samantha tried to stand, but her legs gave way and she collapsed onto the floor. She could hear the others around her, some gasping, some crying out in horror, others too far gone to even react. Their bodies were swelling, their faces contorting as though their muscles and skin were being pulled in strange, unnatural directions. Then the voice of the head villager echoed through the room, cold and unfeeling. "Soon the mountain will claim you." It was then that the full terror of the situation hit them. The ritual wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about becoming part of the mountain itself. Their bodies, their souls would be consumed, and they would be lost to the earth forever. And with that, the villagers turned to face them. Their eyes were now glowing with an unholy light, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of hunger. The mountain demanded its feast, and they were the main course. Samantha tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was already starting to lose sensation, as though it were slipping into numbness. But the worst part, she could feel it, the hunger of the mountain, gnawing at her, pulling her toward it. She was being drawn into the earth, becoming one with the ritual, one with the mountain's insatiable thirst for blood. And then, in the distance, she heard it, the thunderous roar of something vast, something ancient, as though the mountain itself were awakening. But it was too late. The feast had begun, and they were the last course. Story number 4. Lena had always dreamed of visiting a hidden paradise, a place so remote that it seemed untouched by time. When she discovered the secluded island, tucked away in a part of the world few knew existed, she couldn't resist. The photos were intoxicating, crystal clear waters, lush greenery, and white sand beaches as far as the eye could see. The promises of rest, peace, and indulgence called to her like a siren's song, urging her to take the plunge and book the trip. It was meant to be a break, a retreat from the fast-paced world she knew, the bustling city life, the noise, the grind. She had always felt disconnected, like something was missing. A few weeks away from it all sounded perfect. The flight was long and uncomfortable, but Lena's excitement overcame any discomfort. The island was as beautiful as the photos had promised. After her arrival, the locals greeted her warmly. She was struck by their hospitality, their smiles too wide, almost too perfect. They dressed in simple yet elegant clothing, and their eyes gleamed with a strange sort of gleam, a glimmer of something she couldn't quite place. The leader of the village, an elderly man named Rajan, spoke in soft, lilting tones, offering her a place to stay in a charming bungalow by the beach. The air smelled faintly of salt and something else, something sweet yet odd. "Welcome to our paradise," he had said, gesturing broadly to the stunning view. "You are now part of our family." Lena smiled politely, feeling the weight of his words but brushing it aside. She was here for rest, and she would enjoy every moment of this place that promised nothing but tranquility. For the first few days, everything was perfect. She spent her mornings walking on the beach, taking in the beauty of the island, and her afternoons sampling local dishes. The food was delicious, rich, fresh, with vibrant spices Lena had never tasted before. She dined with the villagers, learning about their culture, their traditions, and how they had lived for generations in harmony with nature. There was an odd, almost mystical aura around them, but Lena didn't pay much attention to it. At night, she would sit by the fire, listening to the elders recount stories of the island's history, of how they had found the island, their ancestors' connection with it, and how they had discovered the secret to eternal health. It all felt surreal, like something out of a dream. But it was only when she woke up one morning that she realized her dream had turned into a nightmare. The sun had barely risen when Lena woke up with an uncomfortable itching sensation on her body. She groggily rubbed her eyes, then reached down to scratch the skin on her arm, only to feel something unusual. When she pulled back her hand, she was startled to see small, pulsating sores dotting her skin. Just beneath the surface, the tiny bumps throbbed as though something inside was moving. At first, she thought it was some kind of allergic reaction, maybe from the food or the environment. She had been exposed to so many new things in the last few days: strange fruits, unfamiliar water, even a new type of fabric for the bed linens. It could easily have been something benign, she reasoned. But as she examined the bumps more closely in the dim morning light, her stomach tightened. The sores weren't just random. It was as though they were spreading in an almost deliberate pattern. They were connected, as if a single organism was pulsing just beneath the surface of her skin. Her breath hitched, and she tried to calm herself. It was then that the door to her bungalow creaked open. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but there stood Rajan, his face obscured by the morning fog that rolled in from the sea. His usual smile was gone. He seemed worried, but in a way that felt too practiced, too controlled. "Are you feeling well?" he asked, his voice low, but with an edge of concern. Lena nodded, still staring at the strange marks on her body. I don't know. I woke up with these." She reached up to touch the sores on her neck, a new one forming just below her collarbone. Rajan stepped inside the room, his eyes flicking nervously from the sores on her skin or her face. "It is nothing to worry about, Lena," he said with a quick wave of his hand, as though dismissing her concerns. "Sometimes the island has a way of showing itself. You need not be frightened." Lena's heart began to race. She pulled her sleeve down to hide the sores, suddenly feeling a cold chill sweep through her. There was something in his voice that unsettled her, a note of finality, like he knew something she didn't. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. The island was safe. She had been safe until now. "I'll be fine," she murmured, though the words felt hollow in her own ears. The sensation beneath her skin was growing worse, a slow aching burn that she couldn't shake. "I'll just get some rest." Rajan nodded, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned and left the bungalow as quietly as he had entered, leaving Lena to her discomfort. She sank back into the bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. The skin on her neck burned, as though something was burrowing underneath, but there was nothing to see except the small, growing sores. She couldn't help but feel as though she was being watched. She hadn't felt this way since the nightmares as a child, when the shadows in her room seemed to move on their own. The thought made her skin crawl, but she pushed it aside. She had to get a grip. After a few hours of restless tossing and turning, Lena decided to visit the village clinic. She had to get answers. As she walked down the beach, the ocean air felt cool against her skin, but the strange pulsating sensation only intensified. She moved quickly, hoping to find some relief. When she arrived at the clinic, she was greeted by one of the women from the village, a kindly-looking woman named Mira. Mira led her into a small, whitewashed room and asked her to sit. The doctor was in the back, she explained, but she would take a look at Lena in the meantime. Mira's hands trembled as she examined Lena's skin, her eyes widening as she traced the pulsating sores. The woman's fingers brushed lightly over the marks, and Lena couldn't help but flinch. "This is not good," Mira said softly, her voice cracking. "The island is a living thing, Lena, and it has chosen you." Lena's heart stopped. "Chosen me for what?" Mira stepped back, her face drained of color. "You've been infected by the island's parasite. It has already begun." Lena sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, as Mira's words echoed in her mind. Infected by the island's parasite? She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, as if her body itself was betraying her. Mira's hands were trembling, and Lena could see the fear in her eyes, the same kind of fear she had seen in the faces of the villagers, but never acknowledged. "What do you mean, chosen?" Lena forced herself to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happening to me?" Mira hesitated, looking around nervously as if to ensure no one was watching. Then she leaned closer, her breath hot against Lena's ear as she whispered, "The island, it's alive, Lena. It's been feeding off the tourists who come here for generations, but only a few ever understand what's really happening. It chooses its hosts. The parasites burrow beneath the skin, taking root, controlling you from the inside out." Lena recoiled, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. She wanted to pull away from Mira, but the thought of moving made her stomach churn. Parasites, controlling her? The idea seemed absurd, but there was something about Mira's haunted look that made it feel all too real. The villagers, Lena began. They're all infected, aren't they? That's why they're so welcoming. Why they don't leave. Mira nodded solemnly, her hands shaking as she pulled away from Lena, running them through her hair as if trying to collect her thoughts. Yes, they've been here for years, all of them. They are part of the island's family. The parasites need new blood to survive, and they use the locals to lure others. They want you to stay, Lena, to become one of them. Lena felt a wave of dizziness hit her, and she grabbed the edge of the clinic's counter for support. The sores on her body were now growing more pronounced. They weren't just pustules. They looked like tiny, writhing insects underneath her skin, twitching and shifting. She could feel them moving, and it made her sick. But how did it start? Lena's voice was desperate. I came here for a vacation. I wanted to relax, not become some breeding ground for bugs. Mira's expression softened with pity, but it was quickly replaced by an unreadable look, as if she were fighting some internal battle. The parasites are ancient. The island has been their home for centuries. The locals, the ones who came before me, they all gave themselves to the island willingly. Some thought they could escape the cycle, but they were wrong. The island has a hold on them. It controls their every move. Every thought Lena felt nauseous, her vision blurring as a sharp pain shot through her head. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. The sensation of something wriggling under her skin was unbearable, as if the parasites were trying to force their way out. What do I do? She whispered. Mira looked torn. I don't know. No one has ever truly escaped the island. Once it's inside you, it's only a matter of time before it takes full control. She paused, her voice shaking. You need to leave, Lena. Now, but you can't do it alone. The parasites, they don't want you to leave. They will do anything to stop you. Lena's eyes darted around the room, her thoughts spiraling. She was trapped. She had been warned, and yet the allure of the island, the warmth of the villagers, had kept her there. They had manipulated her, lured her into their web, and now the parasites were inside her, worse than any kind of sickness she had ever known. They were alive inside her, feeding on her, turning her into something else. How do I leave? She asked, the words heavy with dread. Mira's face darkened. The only way is to leave before it's too late, before it takes full hold. But they won't let you go easily. The island won't let you go. Before Lena could ask any more questions, the clinic door burst open and Rajan walked in. His usual serene expression was gone, replaced by something much colder. His eyes locked onto Lena, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of something predatory in them. A hidden malice, like a predator eyeing its prey. You shouldn't be here, Rajan said, his voice low and steady. The island has claimed you. There is no escape. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. This is it, she thought. I'm trapped. She looked to Mira for help, but the woman was already backing away, her face pale and stricken with fear. The realization hit her like a blow to the gut. Mira had already given herself over to the island. She was one of them now. You should have never come here, Rajan continued, his voice growing colder, more distant. You were always going to be part of the family. There is no escaping the island. Lena took a step back, her mind racing. She had to leave. She had to get away. But how could she? The island was alive, and it was feeding on her. And worse, the island had already claimed so much of her. The parasites were spreading fast, burrowing deeper into her skin, wrapping themselves around her nerves. She could feel the cold tendrils creeping up her spine, consuming her. I won't stay, Lena said, her voice trembling but defiant. I won't be part of this. I'll fight. I'll leave, even if I have to swim back to civilization. Rajan's lips curled into a twisted smile. You cannot fight what is inside you. It is too late. The island has already marked you. Lena stumbled backward, desperate to flee, but Rajan's hand shot out, grabbing her wrists with a strength that was almost unnatural. He pulled her toward the door. "You'll join the others soon enough," he said, his voice thick with finality. "But not before you've been properly prepared. The festival is tonight." Lena tried to break free, but the more she struggled, the tighter his grip became. As the door to the clinic slammed shut behind them, she could see the other villagers standing just outside, their eyes cold and unfeeling, their smiles now twisted and unnatural. The path to freedom seemed further and further away with every passing moment, the island's grip on her tightening. The oppressive heat of the evening sun hung heavy in the air as Lena was dragged through the winding paths of the village. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought against Rajan's vice-like grip. The villagers, their hollow eyes following her every movement, parted to let them through, whispering to one another in a language she could not understand. There was a sense of finality in the air, an eerie calm that felt more like a funeral procession than a mere walk through a village. It was as though the entire place knew something she didn't, knew something that had already been decided. Lena could barely keep up with Rajan's pace as he led her to a large clearing at the center of the village. A massive bonfire crackled in the center, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The flames danced and flickered, casting an orange glow over the gathered crowd. She could feel the heat from the fire on her skin, the oppressive atmosphere making her breath shallow, like she was about to suffocate. There was something off about the fire, as if it was burning not just wood, but something else entirely, a darker, more primal energy. The villagers surrounded the bonfire, all of them with their faces painted in strange tribal markings, their eyes wild and unblinking. Their bodies swayed to a rhythm that Lena couldn't hear, but could feel vibrating in the ground beneath her feet. The sound of drums echoed in the distance, pounding like a heartbeat, growing louder with every step they took. "Where are they taking me?" Lena's voice was shaky as she glanced around frantically, her pulse quickening as she realized the festival was already in full swing. "The festival has begun." Rajan's voice was cold, his grip tightening as he shoved her toward the center of the clearing. "And you are the guest of honor, Lena." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Guest of honor? She had no intention of being anyone's guest, let alone part of whatever sick ceremony this was. She tried to back away, but Rajan's grip was unrelenting. The villagers slowly closed in, their eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They whispered something in unison, some chant that filled the air with an unholy hum. The sound of it swirled around her, seeming to echo from every direction, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Stop!" Lena screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the rising crescendo of the villagers' chant. She fought to break free, but her body felt weaker, as though the parasites inside her were already draining her energy, stealing her will to resist. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and a hushed silence fell over the crowd. All eyes were on Lena as she stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the villagers who had begun to form a circle around her. Her heart raced, each beat like a countdown to some inevitable doom. She could feel the parasites beneath her skin, pulsating and wriggling with increasing urgency, as if they too knew that their moment was at hand. At the edge of the circle, a woman stepped forward, her face obscured by a veil of flowing white fabric. She was tall, with a commanding presence that seemed to draw the attention of the entire village. In her hands, she held a long, ornate knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. Lena's stomach turned as she realized what was about to happen. "This is the final part of the ritual," Rajan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tonight, you become part of the island, Lena. You will feed the mountain and become one with us." Lena's blood ran cold as the woman in the veil stepped closer. She raised the knife, her eyes never leaving Lena's. And with one swift motion, she cut through the air, sending a sharp, blood-curdling scream of metal echoing through the night. Lena recoiled, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body betrayed her, paralyzed by the pain coursing through her veins. It was as though the parasites within her were locking her in place, giving her no choice but to follow their will. The woman's knife came down again, this time cutting across Lena's forearm. The sharp sting of the blade as it sliced through her skin sent waves of nausea crashing over her, and Lena stumbled back, trying to escape. But the villagers moved in, blocking her every path. Their hands were suddenly everywhere, gripping her arms, her legs, holding her still as the woman in the veil raised the knife once more. The crowd began to chant again, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't just a rhythmic chant, it was a command, an irresistible force that seemed to pull Lena's limbs, her very soul, toward the blade. The parasites inside her surged to the surface, and she could feel them clawing their way to the outermost layers of her skin, almost as if they wanted to participate in this ritual. "Please!" Lena screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "I don't want this!" But the villagers were unmoved, their faces emotionless, as the woman in the veil brought the knife down again, this time slicing across Lena's chest. A searing pain erupted, and Lena cried out, her body convulsing against the hold of the villagers. Suddenly, the air around her grew thick, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. The fire seemed to blaze higher, the flames licking at the night sky, as a deep rumbling sound echoed from the mountains. The very earth seemed to shift and groan, and in that moment, Lena realized that she was not just a sacrifice, she was the final offering. The island itself was hungry, and the mountain deity that ruled it was awakening. "No!" Lena gasped, struggling to breathe as the knife plunged deeper, cutting into her flesh. Her body jerked, but she was unable to move. The parasites inside her began to writhe in a frenzy, reacting to the ancient energy that was awakening in the island. Just as Lena thought she couldn't take any more, the woman in the veil stopped. She looked at Lena with an almost pitying expression, her voice soft but final. "It is done." The villagers stepped back, and Lena collapsed to her knees, blood pouring from her wounds, her body convulsing as the parasites began to break free from her skin. They weren't inside her anymore. They were crawling over her, writhing like an infestation. But it wasn't just the parasites that overwhelmed her. It was the sensation that she was no longer alone in her body. The island, the mountain deity, had claimed her as part of its family, and the parasites were merely a conduit for its will. Her vision blurred, and she fell forward, the fire flickering in front of her as the world seemed to spin around her. And then, everything went dark. When Lena awoke, she wasn't sure where she was at first. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though it had been through something far worse than mere physical trauma. But as she slowly regained consciousness, her senses came back in jagged waves, sounds, smells, touches, that painted a much more terrifying picture. The air was thick and damp, smelling faintly of earth and something rancid, like decaying meat. The ground beneath her was soft and muddy, and as she pushed herself up, her vision cleared, revealing a sight that froze her blood. She was no longer at the center of the clearing. She wasn't even on solid land anymore. She was surrounded by what appeared to be an ancient burial ground, where the earth had been disturbed, and bodies, fleshless, mummified, lay scattered about in strange patterns. But they weren't human corpses. No. Their bodies were mangled, distorted, and half consumed, as if the parasites from the island had fed on them and abandoned their remains. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she stood up shakily. Her skin was still raw from the cuts, but what horrified her even more was the sensation, the same pulsating, crawling feeling in her limbs, like the parasites had dug deeper into her body, transforming her from the inside out. There was a sudden rustle behind her, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She couldn't see anything at first, but then, out of the shadows, came a figure. Rajan. His face was grim, but his eyes held an emotion she hadn't seen before. Fear. You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" Lena whispered, her throat tight. "Where am I?" "The Hollow," Rajan replied, his words heavy with dread. "The place where the island's true hunger resides." Lena's pulse raced as her mind tried to process what he was saying. She could feel the parasites inside her, squirming, as though in response to the mention of the Hollow. They were no longer just a part of her. They were a part of the island, of its dark history. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but her legs wouldn't obey. They were moving against her will, each step an agonizing reminder that the parasites had claimed her body as their vessel. "You were supposed to be the final sacrifice," Rajan continued, his eyes flicking nervously to the ground. But now you are a part of it. You've joined the island's eternal hunger. Lena's breath became shallow as realization dawned on her. The island, the parasites, the villagers. It was all connected to some ancient, insatiable force. The island itself was alive, feeding on its victims, its hunger stretching back centuries. The villagers had become little more than its tools, luring in outsiders to feed the mountain deity that demanded flesh, soul, and spirit. And now Lena was one of them, an unwilling servant to the very entity that had once consumed the lives of the people she had thought were merely villagers. No. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, her mind spiraling. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but the power within her, the parasites, denied her that freedom. She was trapped, inside her own body, inside the island, and most horrifying of all, inside a system of feeding that had no end. The ground beneath her shook again, this time with a violent tremor that made the trees sway, and the bones of the long-dead village ancestors rattle in their graves. The sky overhead darkened, and from the shadows of the hollow came figures. More villagers, their faces twisted with a strange, otherworldly joy. The woman in the veil emerged from the crowd, her hand raised to the heavens as if beckoning something from the very bowels of the earth. The ritual was not over. It had only just begun. "The festival continues," the woman in the veil said softly, her voice echoing in the stillness. Lena's skin burned as the parasites surged, wriggling beneath her flesh. She could feel them moving more intensely now, as though they were awakening to their full potential, feeding off the darkness that had grown inside her. With every step she took, they moved deeper, their roots embedding themselves in her very essence, her being. "No!" Lena screamed, her voice filled with horror. But it was futile. Her body refused to obey her, her movements directed by the parasites, the island, the deity that now owned her. The villagers circled her, their eyes wild with anticipation, their chants rising again, echoing through the hollow like a ritualistic song of death. Lena could see the twisted smiles on their faces, their mouths agape as they waited for the next step in the ceremony. Rajan stepped forward, his face pale, but he no longer seemed afraid. Instead, he looked almost resigned. "You are one of us now," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your body, your soul, they belong to the island, to the hollow." Tears welled in Lena's eyes as she struggled to regain control, but it was too late. She had already been claimed. The island had taken her, and as the villagers advanced, their eyes glowing with hunger, Lena realized the horrifying truth. She was no longer a victim. She was the feast, the final course in an endless cycle of consumption, destined to become one with the island, the parasites, and the deity that thrived in its depths. As the night descended, the darkness wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the embrace of the hollow. The festival would never end, and she would never leave. Lena's legs twitched involuntarily as her body seemed to fight against her will. She was fully aware, her mind still intact, but her body was no longer her own. The sensation of something crawling beneath her skin, writhing and shifting, became unbearable. The pulsating sores spread, growing larger, more pronounced, as the parasites continued to take root in her flesh. It was no longer just the back of her mind that she could feel them. The parasites had woven themselves deep into her nervous system, controlling her movements, her thoughts. Her own breath seemed labored, as though the parasites had commandeered her lungs. Each time she tried to fight, to scream, her mouth wouldn't move. The locals were watching, their smiles now nothing but a grimace, hollow and twisted. Their once kind eyes were no longer human, their pupils dilated to black voids. It was as if they were in on the terrible secret, understanding fully what Lena was becoming, what they all were. One woman, older than the rest but with the same strange gleam in her eyes, stepped forward. She caressed Lena's cheek gently, a sickly sweet smile creeping onto her face. "You're almost one of us," she cooed softly. "You'll make the perfect addition to the family." Lena's heart hammered in her chest, but there was nothing she could do. Her muscles were stiff with the parasite's command, and she knew with sickening clarity that her fate was sealed. There would be no escaping the island, no returning to her life, no reclaiming her body from the disgusting crawl of the parasites inside her. The woman's hand moved lower, trailing over the fresh, pulsating sores that marked Lena's transformation. She spoke again, her voice lilting and sweet, yet dripping with malice. "The first one is always the hardest," she said. "But after that, it's quite beautiful." Lena's vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness fading in and out. She could feel the parasites feeding, growing stronger with each passing moment. She was no longer sure if it was the infection taking over her mind, or if her thoughts were becoming corrupted by the parasitic creatures themselves. But one thought remained. There would be no escape. The woman continued speaking, but Lena's focus was broken as something warm and wet began to trickle down her arms. The sores had ruptured, oozing a dark, viscous liquid. She could feel it beneath her skin, pushing her muscles, moving them like marionette strings. Her arms raised slowly, her body moving against her will. "Don't fight it," the woman said softly, as if consoling a child. "Soon you'll be able to see the beauty in it. Soon you'll see the island for what it truly is. You'll be free." Lena tried to scream, but her mouth remained locked shut, her body unable to respond. The parasites had taken complete control. She was slipping away, losing herself to the horrific hunger that this island had known for centuries. She was becoming one of them. The days passed in a haze, each moment blending into the next, and Lena could barely tell whether she was awake or still trapped in the nightmares of her own mind. Her body, now completely overtaken by the parasites, moved without her command. She was a vessel, a puppet, controlled by an ancient hunger, feeding and feeding. Her skin was no longer her own. It was an amalgamation of flesh, of parasites and the bodies of those who had come before her. Every time she looked at the villagers, their expressions now empty, hollow shells, she realized that they too were no longer fully human. The parasites had infected them all. In the quiet moments, Lena could still feel the remnants of her old self, the person who had dreamed of a relaxing escape, of beautiful landscapes and fresh sea air. That person seemed like a distant memory now, a fragile echo drowned beneath the parasite's insatiable need for more. And then, one night something shifted. She awoke, or at least she thought she did, but everything around her had changed. The huts, the once friendly villagers, the verdant island, all of it had turned dark. The shadows seemed longer, stretching unnaturally toward her, as if beckoning her closer. The parasites inside her were restless. They thrummed beneath her skin, hungry for more. She could feel them pulsing, squirming, and she could hear their whispers in her mind. "Feed," they whispered. "Expand the family." Lena didn't understand. She didn't know what they wanted from her, but she knew one thing for sure. This was no longer about her. This was no longer about escaping. The island wasn't just a breeding ground for parasites. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the souls of its victims, taking from them everything until there was nothing left but hollow shells. And in the distance, she saw something. It was a new tourist, lost in the jungles of the island, looking for a way out. Welcome to paradise, Lena thought, her body moving forward before she could stop herself. The parasitic voice inside her pulsed with eager excitement. The woman smiled. The cycle would begin again. The end, or is it? The story of Lena, like those before her, is just another chapter in the island's unbroken cycle of hunger and seduction. The island of parasites waits, its shores ever welcoming to the next unsuspecting soul, seeking relaxation or escape. And though the villagers may seem kind at first, there's a dark truth beneath their smiles, beneath their empty eyes. For those who are drawn into the island's web, there is no return, only feeding, growing, and becoming one with the ever-hungry beast that rules this paradise of parasites. And as long as the island exists, there will always be another traveler, another lost soul eager to find solace in paradise, only to be consumed in the end. Story number 5. Tara and Alex had always dreamed of escaping the everyday grind. Their busy lives, filled with work deadlines and city noise, had drained them. So when Tara found the advertisement for a secluded cliffside retreat on the coast, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to unwind and reconnect. The brochure promised breathtaking views, tranquility, and a chance to breathe fresh air, free of distractions. It was a dream come true. The retreat, known as Whispering Cliffs, was tucked away in a remote area, far from the nearest town. The rustic cottages were perched high above the sea, offering sweeping vistas of the ocean below. The first few days were perfect. Golden sunsets, quiet walks through the nearby forest, and cozy nights by the fire. Tara and Alex reveled in the peace that surrounded them, feeling their stress melt away like snow in the warmth of the hearth. However, as the days passed, something began to unsettle Tara. It was nothing tangible, just an odd sensation. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every time she looked out over the cliff, she felt a strange pull toward the edge, as though something or someone was calling her. One evening, as they sat on the porch overlooking the expanse of the ocean, Tara mentioned it to Alex. "Do you ever feel like we're not alone here?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Alex, ever the skeptic, chuckled. "It's probably just the quiet getting to you. It's a retreat, babe, not a haunted house. I'm sure the locals have their ghost stories to tell, but it's just stories." Tara nodded but couldn't shake the feeling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she glanced at the cliff's edge once more, a shiver creeping down her spine. The following evening, the sensation grew stronger. As Tara lay in bed, drifting into an uneasy sleep, she found herself dreaming of the cliff. It was dark in her dream, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the jagged rocks below. In the distance, she saw shadowy figures, moving like ghosts, standing at the cliff's edge. Then they jumped, two lovers in an embrace, falling together into the chasm below, their screams lingering in the air long after they were gone. Tara awoke with a start, her heart racing. Sweat clung to her skin, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She sat up in bed, the echo of the dream still rattling in her mind. She glanced over at Alex, who was asleep, oblivious to her distress. But the images of the falling lovers wouldn't leave her. They had been so vivid, so real. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just a nightmare. But something told her that the cliff wasn't as innocent as it seemed. The next day, Tara tried to shake off the dream. Alex had planned a hiking trip to explore the surrounding trails, and she figured a change of scenery might do her good. As they walked through the forest, Tara couldn't stop glancing at the cliffside in the distance. Every time she looked toward it, she saw flashes of the dream, figures moving at the edge, and the twisted vision of the lovers falling. "Everything okay?" Alex asked, noticing her distraction. Tara forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." They reached a secluded part of the trail where the cliff's edge was closer, the wind howling through the trees. Tara stopped, her feet rooted to the ground as if some invisible force was holding her in place. She stared down at the sheer drop, the waves crashing violently below. For a moment, she felt like she was being drawn toward it, her body teetering on the edge of the precipice. "Tara!" Alex's voice broke through her trance. He reached for her arm and pulled her back, his concern evident. "You're scaring me. What's going on?" She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. "I don't know. It's just, I've been having these dreams about the cliff, and I think it's calling me." Alex laughed nervously. "Babe, it's just a cliff. You're fine. Let's go back to the cabin and get some rest. Maybe you're just stressed." But Tara couldn't shake the feeling. She couldn't explain it, but the pull to the edge, to that place, felt real. And when they returned to the cabin, the unsettling sensation lingered. That night, as Tara drifted to sleep again, the dream returned. The same figures, the same lovers, standing at the edge of the cliff. This time, however, the figures were looking directly at her, their eyes wide with silent screams. As they fell, their mouths opened in a wordless cry, but the scream that echoed was not from them. It came from Tara herself. She jolted awake once more, her pulse racing. This time, she didn't feel the fear she had before. Instead, she felt an overwhelming compulsion to go to the cliff, as if it was calling her by name. The morning after Tara's unsettling dream, the pull toward the cliffside was overwhelming. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Tara woke to a feeling she couldn't quite shake. She had felt something shift within her, a compulsion to go to the cliff, a strange magnetism that seemed beyond her control. Her body had become a puppet, and the strings were being pulled by some unseen hand. Alex, noticing her distant expression, frowned but didn't say anything. He assumed it was just another one of her phases, her mind wandering as it sometimes did. Tara had always been the type to get lost in her thoughts, to retreat inward when faced with uncertainty. But this time, Alex could see the weight of something darker hanging over her. He wasn't sure what, but he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he had with her past moods. "Tara," he said softly as they prepared for breakfast, "maybe we should take a break from the cliff, get some distance." She met his gaze, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, something dark, something that hadn't been there before. But then it was gone, replaced by her usual calm demeanor. "I'll be fine," she replied, her voice steady. "I just want to go to the cliff today. Alone." Alex wanted to protest, to insist that they stick together. But something in Tara's face stopped him. She was adamant, and there was a strange, serene look about her. So he nodded, reluctantly agreeing to let her go. As Tara walked away from the cabin and started up the winding path toward the cliff, she could feel the ground underfoot trembling with each step. The air had grown colder, and the once crisp morning had become thick with a strange heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Every few paces, Tara paused, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. But the path was empty. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the closer she felt to the cliff, and the more the eerie feeling grew. She could no longer deny the unsettling pull that was consuming her. The dream had been no mere fantasy. It had been a warning, a summons from the cliff itself. The vision of the falling lovers replayed in her mind like an endless loop, their bodies twisting as they descended into the abyss, their final screams echoing in the wind. The path ended suddenly, giving way to a large clearing that opened up to the cliffside. Tara stood at the edge, the sea far below crashing violently against the rocks, sending up plumes of spray that mixed with the wind and fog. The view was breathtaking, and for a moment, she felt as though she had truly reached the edge of the world. But something gnawed at her insides, a persistent feeling that she was not alone. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she took a hesitant step closer to the cliff's edge. The wind tugged at her hair, and the voices from her dream whispered faintly in the air, almost indistinguishable from the howling breeze. "Join us, Tara," the voice echoed. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. There was no one there, only the trees swaying in the wind and the distant sound of the waves crashing below. But the whispering voice, insistent, chilling, lingered in her mind. "Join us." The words grew louder, more pronounced. The air seemed to press in on her as the ground beneath her feet seemed to soften. Tara felt herself moving, her body drifting closer to the edge, as if some force, was guiding her every step. She fought to resist, but the compulsion was too strong. The cliff called to her, its siren song impossible to ignore. "Tara, don't do it!" The voice was no longer distant. It was inside her mind, clawing at her sanity. "It's a lie. It's a trap." But her body moved on its own, her feet stepping closer to the edge, the ground crumbling beneath her. She wanted to scream, to stop, but her mouth was dry and her legs wouldn't listen. It was as though she was being consumed by the cliff itself, its hunger pulling her into its depths. Suddenly, a voice broke through the fog of her mind. "Tara, no!" It was Alex. Tara jerked back, her body snapping out of its trance as she felt a pair of strong hands grab her from behind. She twisted in the grip, terrified and confused. Alex had reached her, panting from running up the path behind her. His hands gripped her shoulders tightly, and she looked into his eyes, wide with fear and concern. "Alex," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know what happened. It wasn't me. Something is here." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "It's okay. You're safe now." "You're not alone." But Tara wasn't so sure. As she clung to him, her eyes were drawn back to the edge of the cliff. The shadows seemed to move, as though something beneath the surface of the rocks was waiting for her, watching her. Alex was oblivious to the depth of her fear. He was focused on getting her away from the edge, back to safety. "Let's go back to the cabin. This place is getting to you." But Tara hesitated, her eyes still locked on the cliff. She didn't want to leave, but she also didn't want to be trapped by whatever was calling her. She knew now, deep in her bones, that the cliff was alive. It wasn't just a place. It had a mind of its own, and it wanted her. Reluctantly, she let Alex guide her away from the edge, but with every step she took, she felt something pulling her back, something that was trying to keep her there. The night was suffocatingly still. Tara lay wide awake, her mind racing. The images from her dream had returned, and this time, they were clearer than ever. The faces of the lovers, once obscured and faceless, were now etched in her mind, their eyes pleading, their screams echoing in her ears. The pull of the cliff had only grown stronger, as if it had planted a seed inside her, and now it was beginning to sprout. Alex slept beside her, his rhythmic breathing a stark contrast to the chaos in Tara's mind. But no matter how hard she tried to close her eyes, the whispers continued. "Tara." She tossed and turned, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Alex. She crept out of the cabin, drawn once again toward the cliff. The air was cold and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As Tara made her way back toward the cliffside, the wind seemed to rise in anticipation, swirling around her, pushing her forward. She stumbled, her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to go to the cliff. When she reached the edge, she didn't hesitate. The voices now surrounded her, a chorus of whispers, pleading and commanding. They were everywhere inside her mind, in the air, in the rocks beneath her feet. "You are the one," the voice murmured. "The cliff demands its payment." Suddenly, Tara felt herself falling, not in the physical sense, but in her mind. The world around her tilted, and she saw flashes of images, of past visitors, of lovers who had jumped to their deaths, of their bodies twisted in agony. And then Tara understood. The cliff demanded a sacrifice, a price for its beauty, its serenity. One would always fall, and one would remain. The cliff would take what it was owed, and nothing could stop it. But as Tara stood on the edge, feeling the pull of the void beneath her, she realized with horror that she had become part of the cliff's cycle. No one ever truly left Whispering Cliffs. They were consumed, their spirits trapped in an eternal loop, forced to sacrifice others to appease the ancient force that ruled the land. And now Tara would never leave. The cliff had claimed her, and soon Alex would be next. Tara's mind swam with fear and confusion as she stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast emptiness. The whispers that had once seemed distant now enveloped her like a suffocating fog, pressing in from all sides. Every inch of her body was rigid with terror, her limbs frozen as the malevolent force of the cliff worked its way into her mind. "Don't," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of a nearby rock, trying to steady her body and ground herself. "Don't fall for it. Don't give in." But the voice, once distant, now vibrated through her very bones. It felt as if the cliff itself was speaking to her, its ancient hunger filling her with dread. "You must stay. Stay with us." Tara trembled. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, the air thick and heavy with the presence of the unknown. She could almost feel the weight of the past lovers, their spirits lingering on the wind, waiting for her to join them. The cliff was a living thing, a creature made of rocks, earth, and souls, and it had claimed countless victims before her. She was no different. As the night wore on, Tara could sense the deepening of her compulsion. The more she fought it, the more her body betrayed her. The same invisible hand that had led her here was now guiding her closer to the precipice. And no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't break free. A sickening feeling twisted her gut as she felt a presence beside her. Alex. He had followed her, but his expression was far from one of concern. His eyes were vacant, empty, and strangely distant. It was as though the cliff had already begun to claim him too. "Alex," she breathed, trying to pull him back, but he merely stared at her with an almost glassy look in his eyes. "Tara," he whispered, his voice sounding far too calm. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The cliff is waiting. It wants us." "No." Tara's voice cracked as she tugged at his arm, but her hands passed right through him, as if he were no longer solid. Panic exploded in her chest. "No, Alex, don't!" The wind picked up around her, howling as if the cliff was impatient. The ground under her feet trembled, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. With a sudden, unnatural force, Tara was yanked forward. She stumbled, losing her balance. But Alex, no, not Alex, it was a shadow of him, grabbed her, pulling her closer to the abyss. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but his grip was too strong, too cold. "Let go!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the wind, lost to the cliff. The shadow that was once Alex laughed, a cold, hollow laugh that made her skin crawl. "You belong to it now," it whispered, the voice distorted, warped by something ancient and hungry. "We all belong to it. You will never escape." Suddenly, Tara's world was filled with darkness. The edge of the cliff disappeared from beneath her, and she found herself falling, plunging into an endless void. Her scream was cut off as her body twisted in the air, the ground far below shifting with grotesque shapes. For a split second, she thought she felt something soft brush against her skin. Hands, fingers, but there were no faces, only shadows, a multitude of souls reaching for her. "Join us!" The whisper called again, and this time she couldn't tell if it was in her head or if the voices came from the dark ocean below. And then, with a sickening thud, she hit something cold and hard, her body crumpling like a rag doll. When Tara awoke, she wasn't sure where she was. Her head ached, her body bruised and sore from the fall, but there was no immediate pain, just an overwhelming, disorienting feeling of cold and the sensation of being trapped. As she slowly sat up, she realized she was no longer standing at the edge of the cliff. She was in a place that shouldn't exist, a dark, empty expanse where the sounds of the ocean and the wind had disappeared entirely. The air was heavy and stagnant, thick with the scent of decay. Her eyes darted around. There was nothing but darkness, stretching endlessly in every direction. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat deafening in the silence. And then she saw it. The cliff. It was there, impossibly close, as though it had followed her into this inescapable abyss. But this was not the cliff she had once seen from the cabin. This was something more sinister, its rocks jagged and slick, its surface alive with an unnatural pulsating glow. As Tara stumbled toward the cliff's edge, she was horrified to realize she wasn't alone. All around her were figures, shadowy, ghostly forms, some resembling people, others little more than distorted shapes. But all of them shared one thing in common. They were all staring at her, their eyes empty and black. "No!" she gasped, stepping back, her heart racing with terror. "We're here to stay," a voice spoke, echoing from the shadows. It was neither male nor female, but a blend of both, a chorus of voices that made her skin crawl. And then, the truth hit her like a slap to the face. The cliff had taken her. It had claimed her body, her soul, and now she would never leave. "You will stay with us," the voice echoed again, cold and final. "You will join the others, as we have joined. Together we are eternal. Together we will remain at the cliff's edge forever." Tara tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet had shifted, become slick and treacherous, pulling her back. She was trapped, surrounded by the whispers of the dead who had fallen before her, doomed to remain as part of the cliff's insatiable hunger. Tara felt a chill grip her spine, her thoughts becoming more jumbled as the voices closed in on her. Desperately, she turned back toward the cliff, but it seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if it were no longer just a physical place, but something far more insidious. With every step, the shadows grew closer. She could hear them moving, whispering her name, and a cold sense of inevitability settled in her stomach. There was no escape from this place. There would be no returning to the world she had once known. She was bound to the cliff now, part of its hunger, its eternal need. As Tara's vision blurred and her consciousness began to slip away, she understood. The cliff would never release her. It was always watching, always hungry, always waiting for the next soul to join the ranks of those who had fallen. In the end, Tara's final scream was lost to the void, her body and soul claimed by the very forces she had tried to resist. She was one with the cliff now, an unwilling participant in its endless cycle. And so the cliff claimed another soul, and the echoes of her screams would join the whispers of the countless others who had met the same fate. The cliff would always be hungry, and it would never be satisfied. Story number 6. The group of friends had always dreamed of exploring a hidden paradise, a place so pristine and untouched that only a select few knew of its existence. The lagoon, located in a remote part of the world, was said to be a breathtaking sight. Its turquoise waters, crystal clear and inviting, were surrounded by lush jungles and towering cliffs. For months they had planned the perfect vacation, escaping the chaos of their everyday lives for a week of adventure and relaxation. Rachel, Mark, Lily, and Chris had heard rumors about the lagoon from a local guide who hesitated to speak of it in too much detail. He warned them about the legend, a tale of a massacre that had stained the waters red long ago. But the group had brushed it off, laughing at the thought. Such legends were common in places like this, stories meant to frighten tourists away. They were eager to see the beauty for themselves. The drive to the lagoon was long, the narrow dirt road winding through dense tropical forest. The air was thick with humidity, the trees alive with the chirps of unseen creatures. Rachel could already feel the weight of excitement settling in her chest as they drew closer. They had reached their destination. The lagoon, when they finally arrived, was everything they had hoped for, and more. The water shimmered like a jewel beneath the midday sun, the colors of the lagoon ranging from pale turquoise near the shore to deeper shades of blue as it stretched into the distance. The sound of the waves lapping gently against the shore added to the serene atmosphere. "Wow," Mark whispered, standing at the water's edge. "This place is unreal." The others echoed his sentiments, their voices filled with awe. They spent the day swimming, relaxing on the soft sand, and exploring the surrounding area. The lagoon seemed to hold a strange, calming power, and for the first time in weeks, Rachel felt completely at peace. But as night began to fall, something shifted. The tranquil atmosphere became heavy with an unspoken tension. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The temperature dropped sharply, and the gentle ripples of the lagoon began to grow restless. "Let's head back to the cabin," Lily suggested, her voice a little uneasy. "It's getting late." They gathered their belongings, but as they turned to leave, Rachel noticed something strange. The water, once so clear, had begun to darken. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in hue, but it soon became unmistakable. The lagoon was turning a deep blood red. "That's not right," Chris said, his tone thick with disbelief. "That water, it's—" Before he could finish his sentence, a chilling scream echoed from the depths of the lagoon, a sound so raw and desperate that it sent a shiver down their spines. "What was that?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. The others fell silent, staring at the water. The screams seemed to come from all directions, rising from the surface, fading into the distance, and then echoing back again. The once calm lagoon now seemed alive, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice tight with fear. "Now!" But before they could make their way back to the path leading to the cabin, the shadows in the water began to ripple and churn, as if something beneath the surface was moving. The friends hurried back to their cabin, their footsteps quick and uneven on the trail. The red waters behind them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, drawing their gazes despite their fear. They tried to shake the feeling of unease that had taken hold of them, but it lingered in the pit of their stomachs like an unshakable dread. As they reached the cabin, Mark looked back over his shoulder, a sense of foreboding filling his chest. Did anyone else hear those screams? And that sound in the water? Lily shook her head, her expression pale. "This isn't normal. Maybe we should have listened to the guide's warning." Rachel nodded, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. She had heard the stories of the massacre, the bloody deaths that had taken place centuries ago, but she had never expected to feel its weight so directly. It was as if the lagoon itself had absorbed the pain of those lost souls and was now calling out to them. They gathered in the cabin, but sleep was elusive. The night stretched on with an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden walls and the sounds of the jungle outside. Each of them lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of the lagoon's blood-red waters. Hours passed before Rachel finally drifted into a restless sleep, but the dreams came quickly. She stood once more at the edge of the lagoon, staring at the dark crimson water. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the scene. But there was something wrong. The water rippled with unnatural force, and the surface seemed to shift and pulse like a beating heart. She tried to turn and leave, but her legs refused to move. Her body was frozen in place, trapped by something unseen. The water began to churn violently, and from its depths, something rose. Figures, pale, twisted forms, emerged from the blood-stained lagoon. Their faces were contorted in pain, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached for her with skeletal hands, their mouths open in silent screams. "No!" Rachel screamed, struggling to break free from the grip of the water. But it was too late. A cold hand closed around her ankle, pulling her toward the blood-soaked depths. She screamed, but the water filled her mouth, choking her. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the shadowy, distorted faces of the souls trapped beneath the lagoon, their eyes locked onto hers in a never-ending gaze. When Rachel awoke, her heart was pounding in her chest and sweat coated her skin. The dream felt so real, so terrifying, that it took her a moment to realize she was still in the cabin, safe for the moment. But the air felt thick with dread, and something told her that the nightmare was not over. She sat up, glancing around the room. Mark, Lily, and Chris were still asleep, their faces twisted in uneasy slumber. Rachel wanted to shake them awake, to warn them that something was terribly wrong, but she hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy. They had laughed off her earlier warnings, dismissing them as overreaction. But the lagoon was no longer just a beautiful, serene paradise. It was something far darker. She had seen it in her dream, and now she felt it in the very air around her. Something was coming. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a loud splash from the lagoon. Rachel's blood ran cold. The others stirred, slowly waking up as the sound grew louder, more frantic. "Did you hear that?" Chris asked, sitting up suddenly, his voice sharp with fear. Before anyone could answer, the door to the cabin burst open, and the wind howled through the room. The noise from the lagoon intensified. Screams, splashing, and a deep, unnatural growl that seemed to reverberate through the earth. "We need to get out of here," Lily said, her voice shaking as she grabbed her things. Now. But when they stepped outside, the lagoon was not the serene, tranquil place they had seen earlier. It was alive with movement. Shadows swirled beneath the surface, and the water pulsed with a sickly red glow. A figure emerged from the depths, its pale face twisted in agony, its eyes black as coal. And then, in a split second, Chris was gone. One moment he was there, standing beside them, and the next he had vanished beneath the water, his scream cutting through the night air. His clothes floated to the surface, blood-stained and torn. Rachel, Lily, and Mark stood frozen, the shock of what they had just witnessed still reverberating through their bodies. Chris's scream still echoed in their ears, the sound of it haunted, cut short as if swallowed by the very water itself. The lagoon's red hue pulsed like a heartbeat, deep and sinister, as though it was feeding off the terror that filled the air. "Chris!" Mark shouted, rushing toward the edge of the water. "Chris, where are you? Come back!" But the water remained still, save for the faint ripples left behind by his disappearance. No answer came from the depths, just an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on them, thick and heavy. Lily's voice cracked as she pulled Mark back. "Mark, stop!" "There's nothing we can do." Rachel's mind raced. She could still see Chris's terrified face, his eyes wide with fear as the water pulled him under. Something in the lagoon had claimed him, something far darker than any of them could have imagined. That thing, it's not just a lake," Rachel muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it wants us." Mark looked at her, his eyes wild. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The massacre," Rachel said, her throat dry. "The guide warned us. This lagoon, it's cursed. It traps souls." The horror of it all hit them all at once. The calm beauty of the lagoon, the inviting turquoise water. It was a trap set by something ancient, something evil. And they were its next victims. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet rumbled, a low, guttural noise emanating from the depths of the lagoon. The air grew colder, and the once peaceful atmosphere now felt suffocating. The wind howled, carrying with it an unnatural cold mist that seemed to seep into their skin, chilling them to the bone. "We need to leave," Lily said, her voice shaking with fear. "Now!" Rachel turned to face the others, her heart pounding. "We can't stay here. We need to find a way out, before it takes us too." But even as she spoke, she knew that escape was no longer an option. The lagoon was everywhere. It was in the air, in the water, in the earth beneath their feet. It was as if it had claimed the entire island, and there was no place safe from its reach. They made their way back to the cabin, but the journey felt like an eternity. Each step was heavy, weighed down by the oppressive dread that clung to them like a second skin. The jungle around them seemed alive with eyes, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of the leaves a reminder that they were no longer in control. As they approached the cabin, Rachel spotted something on the ground. It was a small, weathered stone, just like the ones they had seen earlier near the shore. But this one was different. The edges were worn smooth, as if it had been handled countless times. Something about it caught her eye. She bent down and picked it up, feeling a cold shiver pass through her body as she turned it over. There, etched into the stone, was an image. It looked like a crude carving of a person, no, several people, floating in the water. And beneath them, in the dark depths, there were eyes. Eyes that stared back at her, unblinking and filled with malice. This was here the whole time," Rachel muttered, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "This is a warning." Mark knelt beside her, his expression grim. "It's not just a warning, Rachel. It's a mark, a symbol. They were here before us. Those who came before us. The ones the lagoon claimed." Suddenly, the earth trembled again, and the ground beneath them cracked open. The opening was small at first, barely noticeable, but it widened with each passing second, revealing something hidden beneath the surface. It was a structure, an ancient ruin, long buried beneath the earth, but it was clear it had once been part of something much larger. The walls were covered in moss and vines, but they were also etched with symbols that resembled the one on the stone. "We need to get inside," Lily said, her voice urgent. "Now!" They didn't hesitate. Together, they made their way toward the ruins, the fear of the lagoon's curse pushing them forward. As they entered the structure, the air grew colder still, and the sounds of the jungle seemed to fade into the distance. Inside, the walls were covered in more carvings, more symbols, These ones much clearer, telling the story of the lagoon. It was a story of death, of a massacre that had taken place centuries ago when the island was inhabited by a peaceful community. The villagers had worshipped a powerful entity that resided beneath the lagoon, offering it sacrifices in exchange for protection and prosperity. But greed and desperation had led the villagers to betray their own beliefs, and the entity had turned on them, claiming their souls as its own. The lagoon had become a trap, a prison for the souls of the dead. Those who ventured too close to its waters were pulled in, their bodies consumed by the entity, their souls trapped forever beneath the blood-red surface. Rachel felt a chill run through her as the weight of the history settled over her. This wasn't just a curse, it was a pact, an unholy bond that had trapped the souls of the innocent and the guilty alike, and now they were part of it. Rachel, Mark, and Lily stood in the center of the ruins, their eyes scanning the symbols, trying to make sense of the curse. But the more they looked, the more it became clear. There was no escape. The lagoon would claim them all, one by one, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, and a deafening roar erupted from the lagoon. The walls of the ruins shook violently, and the air filled with a foul, rancid stench that made Rachel gag. From the shadows, something emerged, a figure, twisted and deformed, its body slick with blood. Its eyes were black, voids of nothingness, and its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. "Welcome, new guests," the figure hissed, its voice echoing in their minds. Rachel's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had echoed from the lagoon the night before. It was the entity, the one that had claimed Chris. "No!" Mark shouted, stepping forward. "We won't be your sacrifice." But it was too late. In an instant, the ground beneath them cracked open, and the lagoon's blood-red waters surged forward, pulling them into its depths. Rachel screamed as the water swallowed her whole, the coldness of it seeping into her very soul. As Rachel, Mark, and Lily were dragged deeper into the blood-red waters, the world above them faded into nothingness. The force pulling them seemed endless, an invisible current that wrapped around their limbs, tugging and twisting as it drew them closer to the unfathomable depths. The water was colder than ice, numbing their bodies and their minds. But it wasn't the cold that terrified them. It was the suffocating darkness, the feeling of being submerged in something ancient, something alive. The lagoon, they now understood, was not just a body of water. It was a living entity, a monstrous being that fed off the souls of those who came too close. It was hungry, and it had waited for centuries for new sacrifices to feed its insatiable thirst. Rachel's vision blurred as she struggled to keep herself afloat, but it was impossible. The more she tried to fight, the heavier her limbs became. It was as if the very water itself was alive, wrapping around her, squeezing her, pulling her into the abyss. Then a voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice, echoed through the water, vibrating in her chest. "Welcome to your new home," it whispered. "You will join the others. Forever." Suddenly, the water around her shifted, and she was plunged into complete darkness. She couldn't see anything, couldn't even hear the others. For a moment, she wondered if she had been swallowed whole by the lagoon, doomed to remain in its depths forever. But just as the panic began to set in, she felt the faintest touch on her shoulder, followed by the frantic voice of Mark. "Rachel! Rachel, are you there?" The coldness of the water intensified as he grasped her arm, pulling her back toward him. But there was no air, no surface to reach for. The water seemed endless, and the weight of their bodies only made it worse. "What's happening?" Lily gasped from somewhere behind them, her voice panicked and strained. "We're—" But then she went silent. The water began to swirl violently around them, as if the lagoon itself was waking up. The shadows beneath them shifted, and Rachel could feel something moving in the depths, a presence that felt ancient, like it had been waiting for them, watching them from below. Suddenly, there was a sharp tug on her leg, a pull so powerful it nearly ripped her from Mark's grip. She cried out, her heart pounding, but no words escaped her lips as the water engulfed her. She was drowning, no longer a victim of the water itself, but of something far darker, something far worse. Then something cold and clammy wrapped around her waist, like hands, or perhaps something worse. In the darkness, she could hear the whispers again. The voice wasn't from Mark or Lily. It wasn't even from the water. It was something far older, something more terrifying. It filled her mind, driving her to the edge of madness. "You are ours," the voice echoed. "Your souls are ours." Her head spun as the shadows around her grew darker, thicker, more alive. She felt herself being dragged deeper, and despite every instinct in her body telling her to fight, she couldn't move. It was like being submerged in a nightmare where the surface was out of reach, and every struggle only took her further down. Just as she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, there was a sharp, jarring sensation, a jolt that threw her backward. For a split second, she was floating, weightless, her body freed from the suffocating grip of the water. And then, as if it had all been some twisted dream, she saw a faint light above her. She gasped, trying to swim toward it, but the water pulled her down again. This time she heard Mark's voice clearly, his cries echoing through the darkness. "We're running out of time, Rachel." But as she turned toward him, she saw something far more horrifying, a shape rising from the water, a shape that was not human. It was a figure, ancient and twisted, rising from the depths like a nightmare made flesh. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes, dark black voids, were fixed directly on her. The air around it crackled with malevolent energy, and its presence filled the water with an unnatural chill. The figure stretched out a bony webbed hand, reaching for her. "Join us," it hissed, its voice sending shivers down her spine. "Join the eternal feast." Rachel struggled, trying to swim away, but her arms and legs felt like lead. The weight of the water pressed in on her, the darkness closing in. As the figure loomed closer, its hand grew nearer, and she realized with sickening clarity that there was no escape. The lagoon had already claimed them. One by one, Mark and Lily vanished beneath the surface. Rachel's scream echoed, though she couldn't tell if it was heard or simply swallowed by the depths. Her mind raced as she fought for air, fought for freedom, but it was futile. The last thing she saw was the horrific grin of the figure rising from the water, the twisted shape of its body contorting in ways that should have been impossible. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a cold, terrible pressure on her chest as the darkness began to consume her. When Rachel's eyes opened again, she was no longer in the water. She was standing on the shore of the lagoon, but the world around her was different. The sky was dark, and the air was thick with a stench of decay. The water rippled ominously, as if something waiting, was just beneath the surface. And then she saw it. The once beautiful turquoise lagoon had turned an even deeper shade of red. The surface churned with movement, ripples like waves of hunger. And from within the water came the faintest cries, the echoes of the souls trapped beneath. As Rachel stepped closer, she realized that there were others standing along the shore. The figures were not human. They were pale, twisted things, their bodies covered in decayed flesh, their eyes hollow and staring. And then she saw Mark. His body, twisted and unrecognizable, was held together by the very same webbed hands that had pulled him under. Lily, too, was there, her form distorted, a grotesque mockery of what she once was. The lagoon had claimed them all. Rachel felt a terrible, cold emptiness as the figure from the depths emerged again, its eyes locked on her with predatory hunger. The figure was not just the spirit of the lagoon. It was the lagoon itself, the manifestation of the curse that had trapped them all. "Join the feast," it whispered as it reached for her with its cold, skeletal hand. In that moment, Rachel knew the terrible truth. The lagoon would never let anyone leave. It was a prison for the soul, an endless cycle of death and rebirth, feeding on the living, consuming them until there was nothing left. And as the hand touched her, her vision blurred, her body numb with the weight of its curse. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was the terrible, echoing scream of all the lost souls who had come before her. The blood-stained lagoon had claimed its newest victims. These stories remind us that even paradise can hide unspeakable horrors. Would you dare visit any of these places, knowing what lurks behind the surface? Let us know in the comments which tale chilled you the most, and if you've ever had a terrifying vacation story of your own. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true horror stories that will keep you awake at night. Until next time, safe travels if you can survive them.